Several Palestinian families are under the threat of eviction. These developments were preceded by weeks of tension, including around the holy sites. I urge Israel to cease demolitions and evictions in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, in line with its obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law. All settlement activities, including evictions and demolitions, are illegal under international law. Jerusalem is a holy city for three world religions. I underscore that the status quo at the holy sites must be upheld and respected. In Israel, communal violence and inflammatory rhetoric have added a further worrying dimension to the crisis. This localized violence has diminished over the past week, and I commend Jewish and Arab community leaders and civil society organizations for their positive contributions to peace. Furthermore, with every day that passes, the risk that violence could spread beyond Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory increases. This conflict creates an environment that is ripe for exploitation by radicals and extremists. We must prevent at all costs the emergence of a new locus of dangerous instability in the region. It is imperative that we achieve de-escalation to prevent an uncontainable cross-border security and humanitarian crisis. Mr. President, Excellencies, United Nations officials, including my Special Coordinator for the Middle East process and myself, are undertaking extensive diplomatic efforts within the region, including with Egypt, Jordan, and Qatar, and with key partners in the international community to encourage all sides to halt the violence. We are engaging directly with the parties to conflict, including Hamas, in our efforts to secure an end to hostilities. I commend the ongoing efforts of member states aimed at encouraging all parties to exercise restraint, de-escalate tensions, prevent further civilian casualties, and reach cessation of hostilities. And I call on all members of the international community to do everything in their power to enable the parties to conflict to step back from the brink. And I call on the parties themselves to allow for mediation efforts to intensify in order to bring the fighting to an end. These horrific events did not arise in isolation. They must be viewed in the context of decades of military occupation, political deadlock, grievances and hopelessness, and the failure to address the core issues at the heart of the conflict. We know far too well that violence begets violence. The unconscionable deaths, suffering and destruction of the past 10 days only serve to push the prospect of sustained peace further into the future. A revitalized peace process is the only route to a just and lasting solution. It is imperative that we keep this long-term vision alive. It starts by replacing anger and disillusionment with hope for a future in which both Palestinians and Israelis live side by side in peace and security. We must work towards a resumption of negotiations that will address the status of Jerusalem and other final status issues, end the occupation, and allow for the realization of a two-state solution on the basis of 1967 lines, UN resolutions, international law and mutual agreements, with Jerusalem as capital of both Israel and Palestine. The United Nations is deeply committed to working with Israelis and Palestinians and with our international and regional partners, including through the Middle East Quartet, to realize a lasting and just peace. Only through renewing our commitment and redoubling our efforts towards a negotiated solution can we bring this cruel violence and hatred to a definitive end. And I thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Riyad al-Malki, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Observer State of Palestine.
Your Excellency, President of the General Assembly, Your Excellency, Secretary General of the United Nations, Your Excellencies, Ministers, ladies and gentlemen. We thank you for holding today's session upon the request by the Arab group, the OIC, and the non-aligned movement are taking part along with representatives of different countries. This sends a clear message. Stop the massacre. Mr. President, Israel, with its state-of-the-art arms, is targeting families as they sleep to sow the seeds of terror among our people. It is not pretending it was a mistake. It is not even apologizing. It is rather reaffirming that it is its right to commit these crimes, to kill innocent people, and it is blaming the victim. Until today, Israel has killed 230 Palestinians, including 65 children, 40 women, and 15 old persons. It destroyed more than 1,500 residential apartments and 50 schools. The numbers are increasing as Israel continues its aggression. Israel has also displaced 100,000 Palestinians during the pandemic. Call to stop conflicts during the pandemic. To those who say that Israel has the right to defend itself, what right are you exactly talking about? Israel is a colonization power. It is occupying our land. It is persecuting a whole people. Israel would ask you, what would you have done if missiles were targeting your cities? But Israel forgets that its occupation is the root cause of the violence. So I would like to ask you, what would you do if your territory is occupied, if your people were displaced, if your people were killed, detained, arrested, and persecuted? How can an occupying power have the right to defend itself when a whole people under occupation is deprived of the very same right? How can some rush to issue statements to condemn the killing of one Palestinian at a time when the whole world stays silent and turns a blind eye to the genocide of whole Palestinian families? Mr. President, the Palestinian people commemorates its Nakba at a time when it faces further torture and oppression, as it has done in the past 70 years. We are facing many disasters and Nakbas. We defend our history, our nation, and our holy sites. However, not a single day did we let go of our national objectives as stipulated in resolutions of international legitimacy. We have never let go of our struggle. However, Israel, the occupying power, is repeating the same crimes in Sheikh al-Jarrah today in occupied Jerusalem. It is trying once again to displace forcibly Palestinian families in order to erase any Arab Palestinian presence in the city. This aggression is taking place with the participation of the Israeli government, the occupation army, the Israeli courts, settlers, and extremists. Israel, the occupying power, spared no effort in the past decades to obliterate the Islamic and Christian Arab-Palestinian identity of Jerusalem, to displace its people, to smother it with settlements, to divide Al-Haram, Al-Sharif in place and in time. It continues its war against the deeply rooted Palestinian presence in the Holy City. House after house, it escalated these policies, these systematic policies in the past years. Its decision to break into one of the holiest places, the holy Al-Aqsa Mosque, in one of the holiest months, the holy Ramadan, and one of the holiest nights, the night of Al-Qadr, is a case in point of these attempts which failed and will continue to fail. However, Jerusalem responded, as always, to those who said and pretended that they have unified Jerusalem by their occupation, to those who said that they can make peace in the Middle East without our people and on its expense. We responded to those who gave a promise to the occupier to gift it Jerusalem. We said that Jerusalem is not for sale. We responded to those who wanted to divide our Al-Aqsa, that people will protect Al-Aqsa, and we do not care about a promise by those who do not own to those who do not deserve. We reaffirm the importance and the need to respect the current legal and historic status of Al-Haram al-Sharif. We reaffirm the important role of Jordan and the Hashemite protection of the holy places in the city. Mr. President, we have accepted international legitimacy and international law to solve our question. We accepted political work and peaceful resistance as a way to solve the final issues and reach a peace agreement. Continues to procrastinate since the Oslo Accords. Not only that, the current Israeli government does not even believe in the two-state solution. It continues its annexation policies. It continues its colonization of our occupied land. It issues racist laws. It isolates Gaza Strip and violates all political, economic, and security agreements signed with it. The international law is the cornerstone of the international order. It does not tolerate any duplication and any false interpretation. Dealing with Israel as a country above the law will only encourage it to act as such. It is high time for the international community to shoulder its responsibilities to end the Israeli occupation of our land, of our holy sites, of our presence and our future. It is high time to take practical measures to provide international protection to the Palestinian people until they can actually practice their right to self-determination, their right to freedom and independence on their occupied land since 1967 with East Jerusalem as a capital. We urge you to honor your commitments under the international law, including not to Palestine, including East Jerusalem. We call upon you not to provide any assistance or support to entrench and maintain the current status. We call upon you to differentiate between Israel, the occupying power, and the occupied territories and ensure accountability. Every country in the world has the responsibility to ensure that peace, justice, and freedom prevail. It is your right to hold Israel accountable and not to provide it with arms. It is your responsibility to contribute to providing protection to the victims, not immunity to war criminals. It is your responsibility to fight settlements, not those who boycott them. It is your responsibility to be a support to a people persecuted in deed and words. The world should not simply watch and stand idly by. You should stop these crimes. Mr. President, from this rostrum, from the United Nations, whose charter ensures the right of people to self-determination, and in front and before the representatives of states which achieved their independence and their place among nations, we salute your solidarity with us. After your own struggles and history and principles, we saw how people of the world took to the streets in thousands and even millions to defend freedom and humanity, to say to the Israeli occupation, stop, enough is enough. Some would accuse the United Nations of siding with Palestinians at a time when it is siding with its charter It is siding with rights, with the struggle of people to achieve their independence and freedom. The bias which should we fight is any bias that ensures impunity and guarantees impunity to Israel. These wars would never have been launched had the occupation taken responsibility of its different crimes, including oppressing demonstrations and its repeated aggressions in 2009, 2012, and 2014. After long decades of oppression, racial discrimination, and displacement. Mr. President, we call for peace. We are working for peace. However, this cannot come at the expense of our people and its right guaranteed by resolution, by a political process in line with UN terms of reference, with an international sponsorship, which would lead to ending the Israeli occupation of Palestine and its capital. This is what we have informed the U.S. administration and the quartet after the end of term of the Trump administration and its shameful deal, which pretended that Palestine is no longer a critical and central question. However, the events today reaffirm the importance and centrality of Jerusalem and the Palestinian cause at the regional and international level. But at what expense? Generation after generation. This criminal Israeli occupation has caused so much pain which cannot be solved by a truce and a ceasefire. Susie, a child, went to sleep in her house in Gaza with her mother, father, and 4 siblings. She woke up the next day under the rubbles, without a mother, with only one father. Samira and the trees planted by her father in their house's garden in Sheikh Jarrah after the Nakba are still under the threat of forced displacement. Muhammad, who loves running, who loves riding his bike, is today in a prison cell, being deprived of those people. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Observer State of Palestine. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mohammed bin Abdurrahman bin Jassim Al Thani, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Qatar.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
In the name of God, the merciful, the Almighty, distinguished President of the General Assembly of the United Nations, Excellencies, Secretary General of the United Nations, ladies and gentlemen, allow me at the outset to express my official meeting to debate a very important issue that requires an immediate and adequate response from the General Assembly and the international community. We also thank Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his statement. Mr. President, the grave situation in the occupied Palestinian territories, and particularly East Jerusalem, and the bombings on the Gaza Strip targeting innocent civilians and their homes and claiming dozens of lives, including women and children. All this requires that the international community act promptly to put an end to Israeli aggression against the Palestinian people in the Al-Aqsa Mosque and to prevent the recurrence of such events as well as to respect the protection of the Hashemite kingdom over the mosque. Qatar has repeatedly warned about the Judaization policies of East Jerusalem, and we have warned about any attacks on holy places and above all Al-Haram al-Sharif. However, despite the condemnation of the international community in recent years of attempts of the Israeli government and people to carry out aggression against the Palestinian people and expel them from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah, described as ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. There have been numerous attacks on the Al-Aqsa Mosque by Israeli authorities. They have no respect for the sanctity of the month of Ramadan, which has led to the escalation of the situation. The state of Qatar reiterates its rejection and condemnation of aggression on the part of Israeli police and settlers against the citizens of Jerusalem. And we condemn the ongoing violence against innocent civilians. We also condemn incursions and aggression against worshippers by Israeli actors. It goes without saying that these illegitimate practices, which some describe as war crimes, are a provocation towards millions of Muslims and a flagrant violation of human rights, international conventions and treaties, and the very principles of humanity. In light of recent developments, we would like to underscore the need to respect international humanitarian law and the protection of civilians. The use of excessive, disproportionate force against civilians must numerous victims, and particularly the attack on the Al-Shati camp, which has claimed dozens of civilian lives, including 10 members of one single family. Residential buildings and neighborhoods continue to be targeted, and this has claimed the lives of dozens of children. We likewise condemn and reject the targeting of the Red Cross bill. Targeting media and medical facilities as a flagrant violation of international law. We firmly oppose this, and we ask, when will the international community act to protect international law and the provocative unilateral policy of Israel as it attempts to change the demographic composition of the city of Jerusalem and continue its settlement policies? What is currently happening and the inaction is undermining the authority of the United Nations and its ability to maintain international peace and security. And in this respect, we call on the international community to take its responsibility seriously and urgently and immediately protect the Palestinian people by putting an end to Israeli aggression and all illegitimate practices so that the Palestinian people may once again enjoy its legitimate rights, including its religious observances. Mr. President, Qatar's position has always been one that supports all sincere and honest efforts to make real progress in settling the conflict in the Middle East. And in light of recent escalations, we have taken swift steps, including dialogue and mediation. We have undertaken intensive diplomatic efforts in coordination with the United Nations and other stakeholders on the international level. And in this context, Qatar would like to express its appreciation for the laudable efforts made by brotherly countries in order to achieve a de-escalation and a ceasefire on the Palestinian territories. And we would like to particularly mention Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia, who is a non-permanent member of the Security Council, as well as the United States. And here we would like to once again urge the international community to participate in full seriousness in this process, and especially those who can act effectively to bring peace to the Middle East in order to protect holy sites and put an end to all attempts to expel and displace Palestinians in the occupied territories, and to not allow extremist groups to control the situation on the ground. We must also maximize and accelerate efforts to rebuild the Gaza Strip and open up access to aid agencies. Current events must incite the international community to work towards a just, lasting, and comprehensive resolution of the Palestinian issue in order to establish a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital on the basis of 1967 lines in accordance with the two-state solution and the resolutions of the International Quartet as well as the Arab Peace Initiative in order to put an end to this deplorable situation and have a positive impact on peace and stability in the region and the world. And in conclusion, we express our solidarity with the brotherly people of Palestine in its just fight, and we reaffirm our constant position regarding the legitimacy of the Palestinian question and the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Qatar for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Ayman Safadi, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates of Jordan.
In the name of God, the compassionate and merciful, Mr. Volkan Bozkır, President of the General Assembly, Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, dear colleagues, peace be upon you. 65 children, 39 mothers, sisters, wives, and daughters were killed since Israel waged its aggression on Gaza on the 10th of this month. And every day, without the international community shouldering its responsibilities and ending the aggression, parents lose their children and children lose their parents. 100 airstrikes are carried out by 52 warplanes against the besieged Gaza Strip. In 25 minutes, innocent people are killed, the homes of unarmed civilians are demolished, their rights are violated, and their hopes of safe homes, schools, and clinics are killed. In 11 days, the Israeli aggression displaced around 75,000 people in Gaza, most of whom took shelter in the schools of UNRWA, most of which are unable to provide them with humanitarian assistance. We should continue to provide financial support to UNRWA. Enough killing, enough destruction, enough violations of the international law, the UN Charter, and the international legitimacy resolutions, as well as human rights. Enough killing of hope and perpetuation of despair and tampering with the future of the region. The Israeli practices are pushing the region towards more conflicts and deny all the nations of the region the rights to security and peace, and they undermine international peace and security. The United Nations should immediately act to safeguard its charter, its resolutions. The international community should immediately act in order to end the aggression against Gaza and to reach a ceasefire and to compel Israel, the occupying power, to end its breach of the international law and its raids in the occupied Al-Quds and its sanctuaries and in other occupied Palestinian territories, and should provide protection for the Palestinian people. The Israeli occupation has turned Al-Quds, Jerusalem, the city of peace, into an arena of oppression, suppression, and injustice, provoking the sentiments of around 1 billion Muslims through their raids in Al-Masjid al-Aqsa or Al-Aqsa Mosque and Al-Haram al-Sharif, the total area of which 144 dunams is an exclusive place of worship for Muslims. Israel violates the rights of Palestinians to their homes in an attempt to alter their Arabo-Islamic and Christian identity. The displacement of the population of Sheikh Jarrah will be a war crime. Those Palestinian citizens have clear rights to their homes, where they were born, where they lived, and where their parents and grandparents lived. What kind of obscurantism that denies them that right? In accordance with international law, the Al-Quds residents are protected population in accordance with Security Council Resolution 478 of 1980. The occupation has no authority or rule over them. Defending the rights of Sheikh Jarrah residents is a defense of the international law and our common human values. The Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan will continue to defend the people of Sheikh Jarrah and their rights through all possible means and in coordination with our brethren in the state of Palestine. Jordan will continue to deploy all its resources to protect Al-Quds population and to defend Al-Quds and preserving the Arabo-Islamic and Christian identity of the sanctuaries in the occupied Al-Quds, and also protecting the existing historical and legal status therein will continue to be the priority of the custodian, His Majesty King Abdullah II, who continued to reiterate that Al-Quds is a red line and tampering with Al-Quds and its sanctuary is playing with fire. The kingdom will continue to exert every effort and to work with brethren and partners to end occupation and to achieve all the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people, notably the right to freedom and sovereign independent state with the occupied Al-Quds, Jerusalem, as its capital on the borders of the 4th of June 1967 in order to have just and comprehensive peace. This serious escalation should come to an end. Israel is responsible for this escalation. This is the immediate priority, and the way to achieve this is to immediately end the aggression and all Israeli practices that caused this escalation, and to reach a ceasefire that ends this deadly cycle of violence. And the efforts, the international community should concert its efforts to end this historical injustice visited on the Palestinian people. If left unchecked, there will be more serious escalations, and the whole region will remain a hostage of the conflict in every minute. Occupation is the source of all evil. Ending occupation is the only way to achieve peace. Israel will not enjoy security if it continues to deny Palestinians that security. And Israel and the whole region will not enjoy peace if the Palestinians continue to be denied peace. Israel undermines the prospects for peace by the construction, expansion of settlements, confiscation of land and demolition of homes, as well as displacement of population. Israel also continues to attempt to change the legal and historical status in the holy places and alter the demographic composition in Al-Quds and in the occupied West Bank. There is more than 700,000 Israeli settlers in East Jerusalem and the occupied West Bank, compared to 500,000 in 2010 and 370,000 in 2000. The construction of illegal settlements continues in an unprecedented pace, and this undermines the two-state solution, which the whole world agreed to as a way to achieve comprehensive and just peace. Killing the two-state solution leads to the inevitable one-state solution, and this begs the question, is it a state that guarantees equal rights for all its population, or in an apartheid regime. It is an illusion to think of achieving peace, stability, and security under an apartheid regime without finding genuine horizons for ending the occupation and ending this injustice, as well as achieving comprehensive and just peace that meets the aspirations of the nations of the region on the basis of the two-state solution and in accordance with the international law. This an escalation will follow another in a deadly cycle of violence. Either we end this cycle of violence that will threaten international peace and security and lead to a breach of the charter of our organization every few years, or an immediate action to address the basis and the root causes of the conflict in terms of injustice, oppression, and occupation, to restore hope and to reach just and comprehensive peace, which the region and its nations deserve. This is a strategic choice and a regional and international necessity. Dear colleagues, the choice should be clear, and it is high time to act. I thank you, and peace be upon you.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs and Expatriates of Jordan for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Sabri Boukaddoum, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Algeria, speaking on behalf of the Arab Group.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. Your Excellency, President of the General Assembly, Your Excellency, Secretary General of the United Nations, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Arab Group, allow me to express our deep thanks to you, Mr. Volkan Bozkir, President of the General Assembly, for quickly responding to the request by the Arab Group and the OIC to hold this emergency session. This meeting is being held at a time when our Palestinian brothers are going through tragic circumstances caused by the violent crimes perpetrated by the occupation powers against a people whose only fault is refusing to abide by to accept the policy of fait accompli. We all saw the graphic images of killing and destructions. We followed the attacks targeting the lives of Palestinians and their holy sites in occupied Jerusalem. We witnessed the barbaric raids which saw the seeds of terror and death in besieged Gaza. Is it possible to stay silent behind our screens after everything we saw? Counting victims, especially children, women, and old people, and witnessing the huge destruction to the infrastructure. The Minister of Foreign Affairs of Palestine just gave us the numbers. It is possible, after everything we saw, to just listen to flowery speeches justifying the disgraceful silence and inaction by the Security Council, and to those equating the aggressor. Undoubtedly, Mr. President, any attempt to falsify the reality and to turn the table will definitely fail. We have irrefutable evidence that houses were being destroyed while innocent civilians were inside them. We have irrefutable evidence of all forms of oppression and violations of human rights. Undoubtedly, the impunity given to the occupation will only exacerbate the situation, complicate it. It only serves the interests of very few people. Mr. President, this joint initiative by the Arab Group and the OIC, which was later supported by the non-aligned movement, is based on the fact that we want to urge our organization to shoulder its responsibilities based on the Charter. As the Security Council fails to take a stance regarding these tragic events, the Arab Group believes it is important for the General Assembly to act swiftly to adopt practical steps to reach a comprehensive cessation of violence against Palestinians and to use all available tools to protect them and protect their holy sites. Based on that, the Arab Group believes that the gravity of the situation requires collective efforts to ensure an immediate cessation of hostilities and to immediately address the catastrophic humanitarian situation in all occupied Palestinian territories. We need to provide the necessary circumstances to resume the peace process to address the root causes of the conflict by ending the occupation of all Palestinian territories in line with relevant terms of reference. The Arab Group expects everyone to clearly and expressly condemn the systematic killing of Palestinians without any duplication. We expect everyone to hold accountable the perpetrators of crimes against innocent civilians. We call upon the Secretary General of the United Nations to declare a state of emergency, a state of humanitarian emergency, to allow the international community to effectively alleviate the suffering of Palestinian civilians and to take steps to reconstruct Gaza, which is suffering under occupation for the past 15 years. Mr. President, these painful events remind us once again of the reality of the suffering of the Palestinian people, which continue to be occupied and besieged. We salute their attachment to their legitimate rights. We reaffirm that the United Nations has not done enough, especially the Security Council. It has not done enough to find a just, comprehensive solution to the Palestinian cause, which is only fuming the flames of instability at the regional and international level. We have to start calling things by their names. The occupation of Palestinian territories and other Arab territories will always remain an occupation. This occupation will continue to lead to the worst violations. The Palestinian question can only be solved by addressing the root causes of the conflict, namely by ending the occupation of Palestinian territories and allowing Palestinian people to practice their inalienable right to self-determination and establish their independent state with Al-Quds al-Sharif as a capital. In this regard, we reaffirm that Al-Quds al-Sharif, Holy Jerusalem, it remains occupied. It will always remain forever the capital of Palestine. It will remain an integral part of occupied Palestine. We stress the need to preserve the historic and legal status of Jerusalem and its holy sites, including Al-Aqsa Mosque. Mr. President, 76 years ago, the United Nations was established. Ever since, the Palestinian question has always been one of the items on its agenda. Hundreds of resolutions were adopted, and all these resolutions have stressed the right of the Palestinian people, their inalienable right to self-determination, independence, sovereignty, and the right of Palestinians to return to their homes and property. However, the historic justice inflicted upon the Palestinians remains until today. Promises were not implemented, and Palestinians continue to be displaced. Their land and property continue to be taken away. Where are we today? Have we implemented Resolution 181, which provided for the division of Jerusalem with a detailed map? Where are we today after the Madrid Peace Conference and the Oslo Accords? Where are we today after we adopted hundreds of resolutions by the General Assembly and dozens of resolutions in the Security Council, starting with Resolution 242 of 1967 until the latest resolution, 2334 in 2016. Where are we today? Have we implemented all that? During that period, the occupying power continued to occupy more than 85% of Palestinian territories at a time when Jerusalem is victim to campaigns of displacement and destruction, targeting the obliteration of its identity. So we firmly believe that there can be no solution to the Palestinian question without us all taking a courageous position to end two things, namely impunity and the occupation of Palestinian territories. Thank you for listening.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Algeria for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Turkey.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, esteemed delegates. Let me begin by thanking the President of the General Assembly, Mr. Volkan Bozkır, for his leadership in convening today's meeting. I wish Allah's mercy for the Palestinian victims, including women and children, who have lost their lives due to Israeli aggression. I also express our heartfelt condolences to the Palestinian people. I also wish speedy recovery to our wounded brothers and sisters whose number has reached thousands. Ladies and gentlemen, a tragedy has been taking place in Palestine for many years. A heartbreaking tragedy is continuing before our eyes. Through repetition, the perpetrators of this tragedy want us to become insensitive to these outrageous crimes, the oppression of the Palestinian people, and violations of their basic human rights and freedoms. However, we will not remain silent in the face of unspeakable atrocities and brutality, because we know that silence in the face of injustice equals to being accomplice to the crimes committed. He who remains silent in the face of injustice is a mute devil. In order to effectively address the current situation, we should first and foremost diagnose its root causes correctly. The continuing Israeli provocations in Jerusalem, desecration of Al-Aqsa Mosque, violation of freedom of worship, and forced evictions of the Palestinian people from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah triggered the current crisis. All these acts of aggression took place during the holy month of Ramadan, a time of prayer and peaceful reflections for Muslims. In Gaza, not only high-rise civilian buildings, but also schools and hospitals were targeted. They even did not hesitate bombing buildings used by UNRWA, Red Crescent, and media outlets. Gaza's most renowned medical doctors were killed due to Israeli airstrikes. Let me be clear. Such acts of aggression amount to war crimes. We have to assign the blame where it belongs. Israel alone is responsible for what is happening today in Jerusalem, West Bank, and Gaza. Repetition of such tragedies cannot be prevented unless and until Israel is held accountable for its crimes and its sense of impunity is to put to an end. Mr. President, sustainable peace and stability in the Palestinian territories can only be achieved if and when the illegal and inhumane Israeli occupation finally ends. In fact, recent Israeli aggressions are part of its policies to subject the Palestinians to ethnic cleansing and advance its annexation plan. Likewise, Israel's continuing blockade of Gaza has effectively turned this land to the largest open-air prison in the world. We're talking about a land of 365 square kilometers with more than 2 million people. Have a look. These maps set forth the truth. This is the synopsis of the continuing occupation and suffering since 1947. In so doing, Israel aims to further erode the established parameters for the two-state solution and create a new fait accompli. Therefore, what needs to be done now is not only help establish a ceasefire, but also mobilize international efforts to end Israel's occupation and blockade over Palestinian territories. Mr. President, it is unfortunate and disturbing that the UN Security Council once again failed to deliver. At a time when the world needed it most to protect international peace and security, the position of the Council has once again been that of inaction and dysfunction. This is the reason of the call of President Erdogan, the world is bigger than 5. If the Council and its members claim to hold moral high ground, they should have categorically condemned Israel's indiscriminate attacks against innocent civilians and taken action to stop its ethnic cleansing campaign. It is high time for the international community to come up with effective legal and moral means to stop Israel's attacks on Palestinians. Impediments to access of humanitarian aid into Gaza for thousands of displaced Palestinians should be removed. Mr. President, in the past, given the inaction of the Council, the UN General Assembly was able to adopt landmark resolutions on the protection of civilians, protection of Palestinians, and the status of Jerusalem. These two issues remain at the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict today. The international community has a responsibility to protect the Palestinian people. The resolution this esteemed body adopted on June 13, 2018, called for a consideration of measures to guarantee the safety and protection of the Palestinian civilian population. Also called for ending the closure and restrictions imposed by Israel on movement and access into and out of the Gaza Strip, and urged the provision of immediate and unimpeded humanitarian assistance to the Palestinians in Gaza. In line with this decision, we have to work for the establishment of an international protection mechanism for the Palestinian civilians. These efforts should include physical protection through establishment of an international protection force with military and financial contributions of the willing countries. Ensuring Israel's accountability for the crimes it committed is also vital to prevent reoccurrence of such acts of aggression. We believe that human rights mechanisms of the United Nations and the International Criminal Court have important roles in this regard. Mr. President, it is also the responsibility of the international community to end this cycle of violence. In order to achieve peaceful coexistence between Palestinians and Israelis, peace process and the two-state vision should be revitalized. The status of Jerusalem as the center of three Abrahamic religions is one of the most important components for a lasting solution. Here I'd like to emphasize also the following. Those who criticize the aggression of the Israeli government are faced immediately with accusations of anti-Semitism in an attempt to silence them. Yet we believe that just as Islamophobia and Christianophobia, anti-Semitism is also a crime against humanity. Dear ministers and delegates, it is also high time for the Palestinians to resolve their differences and achieve reconciliation. It is time for that. Only a united Palestine could own up the Palestinian cause and effectively address the sufferings of Palestinian people. Elections should be held without further delay. It should also not be forgotten that Israel is the one that is preventing the holding of the elections. Mr. President, legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people for freedom and dignity can no longer be repressed. A just, comprehensive, and lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can no longer be delayed. Turkey will continue to stand by the Palestinian people for the realization of their legitimate aspirations and protection of their rights and freedoms. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Turkey for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Maktoum Shah Mahmud Hussein Qureshi, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Pakistan.
Mr. President, Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, there are times in history when the decisions of nations are remembered by posterity. This is one such moment. What we do today or cannot do will be recorded in history. Driven by arrogance and emboldened by impunity, Israel has mounted a relentless onslaught on the occupied and beleaguered people of Palestine. As we speak, children, women, and men in Palestine are being killed with impunity. In 1 week of Israeli attacks, over 250 Palestinians have been killed and thousands injured. 1/3 are women and children. Death echoes in every home in Gaza. The Israeli airstrikes are responsible for the taking of every single life of the Abu Hattab family. 2 were women and 8 children. Let that sink in for just a moment. Hundreds of such tragedies are being enacted every hour in Gaza and other parts of the Palestinian territories. So far, over 50,000 Palestinians have fled their homes in Gaza. There is limited access to water, food, hygiene, and health services. Hospitals and access to water and sanitation services depend on electricity. Fuel for the power plants has almost run out. Gaza is plunged in darkness, literally and metaphorically. The only light is that of Israeli explosions. This is Palestine, where in full view of the world, the Israeli airstrikes bring down entire buildings to kill and terrorize innocent Palestinians and even silence the media. It is time to say enough. The voice of the Palestinian people cannot and will not be silenced. We, the representatives of the Islamic world, are here to speak with them and for them. Mr. President, it is appalling that the Security Council has been unable to exercise its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. The Security Council has failed even to demand a cessation of hostilities. Those preventing the Council from doing so bear a heavy responsibility. In these circumstances, the General Assembly must assume its own responsibility. We must not fail the Palestinian people at this critical juncture. Mr. President, our first priority must be to halt the Israeli aggression. I hope that even at this 11th hour, the Security Council will call for a cessation of Israeli attacks. If it fails to do so, the General Assembly must make this demand on behalf of the entire international community. Let us be clear, there is no moral or military equivalence between the beleaguered and occupied Palestinian people, who have no army, no navy, no air force, and the Israeli war machine, one of the most powerful in the world. This is a war between a military occupier and an occupied people. It is a conflict between illegal occupation and a legitimate struggle for self-determination. In this context, it is worth recalling General Assembly Resolution 2649 of November 1970, which affirms the legitimacy of the struggle of peoples under colonial and alien domination, recognized as being entitled to the right to self-determination, to restore to themselves that right by any means at their disposal. Second, we should mobilize all possible humanitarian help for the devastated Palestinian population in Gaza and other parts of the occupied territories. In addition to the UNRWA emergency appeal, the Secretary General should launch a comprehensive humanitarian assistance plan to provide succor and sustenance to the Palestinians. We need to send medical teams, medicines and other supplies, food, other necessities to Gaza and other parts of the occupied Palestinian territories. We welcome the access being provided by Egypt to Gaza. Israel must open all access points to Gaza to ensure the timely and urgent delivery of international assistance. Third, the General Assembly should call for concrete steps to protect the Palestinians. We should deploy an international protection force, as was called for in the General Assembly Resolution ES 10/20 and as demanded by the Islamic Summit Conference on the 18th of May 2018. If the Security Council cannot agree to send the protection force, a coalition of the willing can be formed to provide at least civilian observers to monitor a cessation of the hostilities and supervise the provision of humanitarian help to the Palestinians. We also call on the Secretary General and the High Commissioner of Human Rights to offer Israeli gangs at the present time. Fourth, the General Assembly should condemn Israel's forcible and illegal eviction of Palestinians, including in Al-Jarrah district of Jerusalem, and continued construction of Jewish settlements, the first Qibla of Islam, during the month of Ramadan, and Israel's brutal and indiscriminate aerial and land bombardment of Gaza. Israel's crimes against humanity should not escape accountability. There should be no impunity for violation of international law, including the Fourth Geneva Convention and other human rights conventions. The Human Rights Council, the ICC, war crimes. Fifth, we must revive concrete efforts to end Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories and to dismantle the illegal settlements and the apartheid-like regime Israel has imposed in the occupied territories. The General Assembly should secure unconditional implementation of Resolution 242 of November 1967, in which the Security Council declared the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war and demanded that Israel withdraw its armed forces from territories occupied in the 1967 war. It is therefore imperative to initiate bold steps to secure the implementation of the Security Council and General Assembly resolutions calling for the establishment of a viable, independent, and contiguous Palestinian state with Al-Quds, Al-Sharif as its capital. Pakistan endorses President Abbas's call for an international conference to secure a peaceful settlement. Mr. President, the Palestinian tragedy is at the heart of the turmoil and the conflicts in the Middle East. It is also the principal root cause of the humiliation and anger in the Muslim and Arab world. Anger which breeds extremism and often spawns acts of violence. A just solution for Palestine is imperative for the maintenance of regional and global peace and security. Clearly, the onus for restoring peace rests on Israel. It must end its occupation. It must implement the resolutions of the Security Council and the General Assembly. This General Assembly session must send a clear message to the Palestinian people and to Israel. It is only through determined and decisive action that this Assembly can restore the credibility of the United Nations and demonstrate its effective role in preserving world peace and global order based on equity and justice. I end with a verse from a great resistance poet of Pakistan. "E arz-e Palestine, main bhi hazir hoon." O land of Palestine, I too am there for you. I thank you.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Pakistan for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Retno Lestari Priyansari Marsudi, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Indonesia.
Mr. Secretary General, I'm here today to fight for humanity. I'm here today to fight for justice for the Palestinian people. I'm here today to call for an end to the violence and for immediate ceasefire to save the lives of innocent people, including women and children. The safety and well-being of mankind is always our #1 priority. I'm sure that each one of us are touched when confronted with images of a 2-month-old baby injured and pulled away from the rubble as her family lay dead. The only question we should ask ourselves is, how much longer shall we let these atrocities continue? All of us know that this conflict is asymmetric by nature between Israel, the oppressor, the occupying power, and the Palestinian, the occupied, who are continuously being oppressed. Occupation is the core issue. The international community owes the Palestinian people a long overdue independent state of Palestine, living side by side in equal footing with all of us. This continued occupation and aggression by Israel does not only warrant condemnation, but it is also a grave violation of international law that demands our actions. Thus, I call the UN General Assembly to take 3 actions. First, stop the violence and military action to prevent further casualties. At the same time, the General Assembly should demand for an immediate, durable, and fully respected ceasefire. All avenues must be exhausted to de-escalate the situation urgently, as we also support continued and relentless effort by the Secretary General. Furthermore, we must be able to prevent future recurrence of the atrocities. In this regard, the General Assembly should call for the establishment of an international presence in Al-Quds to monitor and to ensure the safety of the Palestinian people in the occupied territories and to protect the status of Al-Haram al-Sharif compound, the holy place for 3 religions. Second, to ensure humanitarian access and protection of civilians. Our ultimate responsibility is to save lives. And every minute we spend here deliberating could mean another Palestinian life lost. I call the General Assembly, together with UN agencies and other actors, to step up efforts in providing humanitarian assistance to the affected Palestinian people. It must urge Israel to open and allow access for the delivery of humanitarian aid, including to Gaza, which has been under siege for more than 13 years. Third, pursue a credible multilateral negotiation. Credible negotiation is very important to advance a just and comprehensive peace based on 2-state solution in line with internationally agreed parameters. The General Assembly has moral and political responsibility to ensure that peace negotiations take place. We must put a stop to the systematic efforts by the occupying power that may leave nothing left to be negotiated. We must not allow the Palestinians to have no other choice but to accept injustice for the rest of their life. Therefore, we have to stop this injustice now. We have to continue our support to Palestinians to get their independence and justice. Mr. President, in recent days, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we witnessed the erosion of trust in multilateral institutions. Today, we hold this meeting with one main purpose: to ensure that justice prevails for the Palestinians. This meeting will be seen as a litmus test for multilateralism. We must remain committed and stand united in our efforts against all illegal acts of Israel toward ending the occupation in Palestine. We have to act now together. UN has to act now. I thank you.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Indonesia for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Sheikh Ahmed Nasser Al Mohammed Al Sabah, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister of State for Cabinet Affairs of Kuwait.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
In the name of God, the merciful. Mr. Volkan Bozkır, President of the 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly, Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, may the peace of God be with you and His blessings. Allow me at the outset to express our appreciation and our gratitude to Mr. Volkan Bozkır, President of the 75th Session of the General Assembly, for all his efforts in preparing this important meeting held at the request of two Arab groups and Muslim groups in the light of the violence and aggressive acts taking place in the OPT and East Jerusalem. I wanted to confirm the support of the State of Kuwait for the statement made by the Islamic OIC, Arab group, and the non-aligned group in this meeting, and I'd like to thank the Secretary General for his statement. Mr. President, this month coincides with the 58th anniversary of Kuwait's accession to the United Nations, at a time when we are renewing our commitment and our attachment to the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and our determination to do everything to reestablish peace. We were keen to be here today to renew our support and ongoing attachment to the principles and our commitment to defending the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. And from this rostrum, we congratulate them on their tenacity and their struggle to recover all their legitimacy. Mr. President, 75 years ago, when we agreed to adopt the United Nations Charter based on which this organization was established, we all promised ourselves to spare future generations the scourge of war and to abide by, respect the rights and dignity of men, and to make sure that peace and international security prevailed. These were the promises we made when we came into this international organization. Now, we are here today in a special meeting dealing with two items on the agenda: the situation in the Middle East and the question of Palestine, when there are serious concerns facing the international community following the dangerous escalation in the OPT, including East Jerusalem, following the Israeli brutal aggression against the lives, property, and holy sites of the people of Palestine. What we're seeing today are acts of hate perpetrated by Israeli forces with illegitimate settlers, and this is all against innocent, defenseless Palestinian people, and the demolition of homes and aggression against people in the sight of the international community. These are all practices that confirm the fact that Israel is resolute as an occupying power in enshrining its continuing its occupation efforts, which is against the Charter and a blatant affront to international law. The State of Kuwait strongly condemns all policies and crimes perpetrated by Israel as the occupying power in the city of Jerusalem and in all occupied Palestinian territories. We also condemn all Israeli settlement practices geared towards seizing homes and properties of Palestinian citizens in the occupied Palestinian territory, and more importantly in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, to violate the holy sites of these people and to forcibly displace them and Judaize the city. Mr. President, the entire world is aware that the Palestinian cause and question is a key issue par excellence for all Arabs and Muslims. East Jerusalem, as the capital of the state of Palestine, will remain an integral part of the occupied Palestinian territory since 1967. The Al-Aqsa compound, which is the third holy site of Islam, is particularly important and has a special status for Muslims around the world. If we genuinely wish to ensure that we address the main reason behind this recent upsurge of violence in the occupied Palestinian territories, we must confirm and recognize that this is the result of the longest military occupation in the contemporary world, and this is a consequence of Israel's attempts to stoke tensions following the aggressive policies in the holy city in the midst of these holy sites for Muslims, and to appear as victims instead of aggressors. We reject all these attempts by the Israeli occupying forces and any changes that they're trying to effect on this territory. It is very difficult, it's very dangerous to attack the legal principles that have been set up for years. There are over 700 resolutions adopted by the General Assembly since 181, and there are 86 resolutions adopted by the Security Council since 1967, starting with 242 and other resolutions because of their importance, including 2334 and 478. These confirm the importance of not tampering with the special status of Jerusalem and not taking any measures that can change its nature. The occupying power must abide by its commitments and the private property in the occupied territories. They cannot seize homes, as the settlers are trying to do. We pay tribute, Mr. President, to all efforts made by Arab and international entities to put an end to Israeli aggression and their tragic consequences from the humanitarian standpoint, which are only aggravating the difficult situation faced by Palestinians in the occupied territories. It is a responsibility borne by the Security Council as the main body tasked with maintaining international peace and security. They must shoulder the responsibility and put an end to Israeli aggression, which has led to more than 256 victims, including women and children, and has led to the displacement of more than 7,000 people, including many who are now homeless. The Security Council, as long as it remains silent, means that Israel will never cease its crimes and aggressions against unarmed civilians nor stop their settlement activities. It goes without saying that the lack of attributing responsibility to Israel and holding them, making sure that they remain act with impunity, will only cause these crimes to continue and worsen the situation in the occupied territories and cause further suffering. These Israeli practices means that we must all now more than ever activate the international mechanisms, political and legal mechanisms, to ensure that the occupying power will be held accountable for its continued violations against the Palestinian people. And these are guaranteed and respected under international law and the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949. We must put a stop to the murders and killings of civilians and the destruction of homes and buildings, the destruction of property and their acquisition, the acquisition of Palestinian property, in addition to the blockade against Gaza for 14 years now, as well as repeated aggressions against holy sites. By way of conclusion, sir, Kuwait wishes to confirm its support for Arab, Islamic, or international efforts to put an end to Israeli aggression and to revive the peace process and negotiations based on internationally agreed principles so that the Palestinian people can recover all their political legitimate rights and build their independent state on their territory with East Jerusalem as their capital, with the lines defined in 1965 and in accordance with international legality and the relevant resolutions of the Security Council, as well as in line with initiatives of peace initiatives by the Arab League since then. Thank you.
I thank the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of State for Cabinet Affairs of Kuwait for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Abdallah Shahid, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Maldives.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues. For over 7 decades, we have discussed the question of Palestine at this General Assembly. Year after year, the halls of this august body have heard the same speeches, held the same debates, passed resolutions. And for over 7 decades, our collective will and resolve to address this issue has failed. Very little has changed on the ground. Generations of Palestinians have lived and continue to live under occupation and oppression. And in the past few weeks, the situation has worsened. Palestinians have been waking up to the sound of bombs, thanking the Almighty Allah for making it yet to another day. They are being attacked in their homes and even on the grounds of the holy Al-Aqsa Mosque. Families are being forced to leave their homes. Innocent people, innocent children are dying. Buildings are crumbling under rocket fire. And all of this during the holy month of Ramadan and Eid al-Fitr. Usually at a time for celebration, family, and kindness. This has reached a predictable certainty. Yet, this is the lived reality for the Palestinian people. This is life under occupation. Mr. President, the Maldivian government and people are gravely concerned over the escalating violence against the Palestinian people in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. We strongly condemn Israel's violent aggression and the excessive and indiscriminate use of force, especially on civilians and civilian infrastructure, on media personnel and their officers, on UN facilities. We believe that further deterioration of the situation will have serious and far-reaching security implications in the region. Mr. President, the COVID-19 pandemic may have normalized the term isolation globally. But for almost 15 years, over 2 million people in Gaza have been forcibly isolated from the rest of the world. At just 41 kilometers long and 12 kilometers wide, it remains the world's largest open-air prison. There is no safe place in Gaza. The indiscriminate bombings have killed hundreds, displaced tens of thousands, obliterated key infrastructure, including the only COVID-19 testing facility in Gaza. Without an immediate ceasefire, all that will remain is rubble. The violence has further victimized the most vulnerable, women and children. Children, which we in this hall every year commit to protect. The ongoing conflict has taken the lives of far too many Palestinian children. Over the past week alone, over 60 innocent children have been killed and many more injured. Many are forced into arbitrary detention. Many are harmed, inflicted with lifelong trauma. The international community has a duty to protect them. We cannot leave them behind. Our commitment to every right for every child must also include Palestinian children. Mr. President, Excellencies, the international community cannot and must not ignore the plight of the Palestinian people. Their suffering, the injustice and inequality they face must not be discounted. We must stand with them in solidarity. We must rally for their protection. This is why supporting the United Nations Relief Works Agency for Palestinian refugees in the Near East is paramount. The deteriorating situation warrants more support. Millions of Palestinian people depend on UNRWA's support for shelter, for food, for education, and for health care. We join calls for unhindered humanitarian access to the people of Gaza. Essential humanitarian supplies, food, fuel, and medical supplies, including supply to counter the spread of COVID-19, must be allowed. This is urgent. Mr. President, the Maldives firmly believes that an internationally accepted solution is the only viable and long-term solution to finding lasting peace in the region. We stand with our sisters and brothers in Palestine in securing their inalienable rights. We call for a sovereign and independent state of Palestine based on the pre-1967 borders, East Jerusalem as its capital. Mr. President, the Palestinian people deserve a life of peace, prosperity, and dignity. The Palestinian people deserve peace, so does the entire region. We must work towards long-lasting solutions to long-standing conflicts. But long-lasting solutions can only be possible with the cessation of violence. That is the first step. We therefore join the global call for an immediate ceasefire and for much needed humanitarian access. Peace can only be possible with undeterred will and commitment. It is possible through dialogue and negotiation, through respect for human dignity and international law. This is the only way forward, the only way to ensure lasting peace for this long-standing conflict, for the region, and for the Palestinian people. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Maldives for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Osman Gerandi, Minister for Foreign Affairs, Migration and Tunisians Abroad of Tunisia.
In
the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. Mr. President of the United Nations General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General Antonio Guterres, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to sincerely thank Mr. Bozkir, the President of the 75th Session of the United Nations General Assembly. I would like to thank him for his response to the call from the OIC and the Arab Group in New York to convene this emergency meeting that was required by developments in occupied Palestine and the Gaza Strip, in the context of the escalation of the unjust Israeli occupation in Palestine and the refusal of the Israeli occupying forces to respond to the appeals of the international community and free peoples to cease this barbaric aggression. It is no surprise that this is the position of the occupying power. It has been its position for 73 years of occupation, during which we have witnessed many violations of international law, international human rights law, and the provisions of humanitarian law, with a complete absence of accountability, even as the crimes of the occupier are war crimes, crimes of genocide and ethnic cleansing. When will these violations be dealt with the proper seriousness to put an end to this policy of impunity, under cover of which the occupying power has hidden for decades This aggression against the Gaza Strip and the occupied territory has killed 65 children and 40 women. Among those who have died, more than 8,000 Palestinians have been injured, more than 52,000 are homeless, hundreds of buildings have been destroyed according to United Nations reports. These are figures that the latest developments have undoubtedly exceeded due to the mass destruction machine which is continuing its action on behalf of the occupying forces. How many martyrs will have to fall? How many women will be widowed and will lose their children? How many children will lose their lives, lose their childhood, lose their innocence? How many families will be left homeless? How many homes and shelters will be destroyed? How much land will be seized and needs to be seized before the international community finally takes steps to put an end to this unprecedented crisis? 65 children in just a few days. What crime could be worse than killing innocent children, including infants, to leave them on the streets, to displace them, for these crimes to at last be considered war crimes and referred to the ICC? Mr. President, the current developments, including the targeting of holy sites, forced displacement affecting those in the district of Sheikh Jarrah, the escalation in Gaza, this is just the latest episode in the long series of Israeli crimes. The continuation of occupation and settlement building policies for a status quo and in order to change the composition of Palestinian towns is the proof, as if anyone needed, that this entity is a colonizing entity, an entity of apartheid and of occupation which has never believed in peace. And so in the face of these provocative policies, if the international community is not able to put an end to these violations, Israel will continue to act outside the law, above the law and international law, and this will in no way serve international peace and security. The fact that we are speaking before the United Nations General Assembly today, as we previously spoke before the Security Council, confirms our position to defend international law and the Charter, which are being violated day after day by Israel. Mr. President, since the beginning of this unjust aggression against the fraternal Palestinian people, Tunisia has, through the President, asked the international community to put an end to these violations on the basis of our firm commitment to stand alongside the Palestinian people and law, and on the basis of that call from the President, Tunisia will spare no effort through its membership of the Security Council, as well as its membership of various different international and regional organizations, and through its contacts with friendly countries, will spare no effort to bring an end to this aggression, and we will continue our diplomatic efforts with the members of the Security Council and international relevant stakeholders in order to national law. Today we are relying on the General Assembly as the primary representative organ of the United Nations, representing all the peoples of the world, to shoulder its historic, political and moral responsibilities to bring an end to this aggression that sees Israeli occupying powers in the occupied Palestinian territory and the Gaza Strip, and call upon them to immediately establish a ceasefire and to take determined measures in the face of this continued military action, which is a provocation. Our position in the face of the continued Israeli violations is to provide protection to the Palestinian people and to refer to the International Court of Justice and the ICC for the crimes committed. In this respect, we welcome the acceptance of the Committee Against Apartheid in Geneva of the Palestinian complaint and to begin an investigation into the serious violations against the Palestinian people and into systematic, generalized, widespread discrimination against Palestinians, and we hope that this will be a first step towards accountability. Mr. President, Tunisia once again calls upon the international community to bring an end to Palestinian bloodshed and to act immediately to bring an end to Israeli aggression, to prevent the humanitarian situation from further deteriorating in the Gaza Strip and in the occupied territories, and to prevent the region sliding into instability and violence. We call upon regional and international stakeholders to call upon Israel to end its unjust blockade against Gaza, which has lasted for more than 15 years. These calls to step up their humanitarian response and support in the face of an unprecedented situation in a city that has become unlivable due to the blockade, as is demonstrated in United Nations reports. Tunisia calls upon the United Nations Secretary General and the Middle East Peace Process Coordinator and all stakeholders to continue their efforts to bring an end to the Israeli escalation, which is condemnable, and to prevent it from happening again. We call upon international parties, including the Quartet, to act to put an end to these Israeli crimes and for them to be ended, and for an end to settlement building activities as provided for in Resolution 2334, and to once and for all end its intentions to annex more Palestinian territory. This is a precondition for continuing serious negotiations. Mr. President, one doesn't need to be Arab, Muslim, Christian or Palestinian to believe in the just nature of the Palestinian question. You simply need to believe in the humanity of human beings wherever they may be. The aggressive, expansionist Israeli policy will do nothing to change the nature of the occupation and will not have any legitimacy. The occupation remains an occupation which has been rejected by international law, by the Charter, by law. Justice remains justice, as is recognized by everyone, by the Charter and by international law. Here I would like to speak to the people of Palestine with the words of a Tunisian poet. If the people want to survive, they need to respond to the call of destiny. And Tunisia will continue to support Palestine until the Palestinian people recover all of their inalienable rights, including the right to self-determination and the right to build a Palestinian state with its capital in Al-Quds al-Sharif, Jerusalem. Thank you.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Migration and Tunisians Abroad of Tunisia for his statement. I now give the floor to His Highness Prince Faisal bin Farhan Al Saud, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Saudi Arabia.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, We thank God. Peace and prayers be upon His messenger, Your Excellency Mr. Volkan Bozkir, President of the General Assembly, Your Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, peace and blessings be upon you. I would like to thank you for holding this meeting on the situation in the Middle East to discuss the developments in the occupied Palestinian territories due to the provocative Israeli measures that have ignited the feelings of Muslims all over the world, from Bab al-Amoud to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and its courtyard and the Sheikh Jarrah. I would also like to thank His Excellency Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his efforts to put an end to this crisis while preserving the rights of the Palestinian people. Mr. President, the latest escalating situation and the continued aggressions against the rights of the Palestinian people is a dangerous violation of international law and the UN Charter, which provides for the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force and bans any threat to international peace and security or stability all over the world, while undermining the chance for the two-state solution, promoting violence and extremism, and torpedoing all international efforts to bring about peace, stability in the region. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, proceeding from its position as head of the OIC, which was established after setting fire in Al-Aqsa Mosque in 1969, represents more than 25% of the members of the United Nations, representing 57 member states. We would like to stress what has been agreed upon in the open-ended virtual emergency meeting of the Executive Committee at the level of Foreign Ministers of OIC held on the 16th of May 2021, which rejected and condemned the continued Israeli occupation of the occupied Palestinian land, including East Jerusalem, and the establishment of an apartheid regime through building settlements, demolishing Palestinian properties, building an expansion wall, confiscating Palestinian territories, houses and properties, evacuating and forcefully displacing Palestinians from their homes and lands. We express our sincere concern due to the Israeli occupation policy that is expanding in Palestinian territories, especially the evacuation of hundreds of families from their homes by force from the occupied East Jerusalem, including Sheikh Jarrah and Salwan, people who are facing such forceful evacuation by extremist settlers with the support of the Israeli occupation authorities, with the support of apartheid courts. We call for an immediate end to such policies and illegitimate practices which run counter to the UN Charter, the Fourth Geneva Convention, international human rights law, and UN resolutions, including Security Council Resolution 2334. We have to take immediate international measures to put an end to such measures. Your Excellencies, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has time and again warned that violence will only bring violence, and the cycle of violence will only bring about more ignition to the conflict. We denounce the use of force against unarmed civilians and any unilateral and provocative measures or any ignition of extremism, violence, or hatred by any party. We stress the need to never deviate from the noble objective, which is bringing about just and durable peace based on the two-state solution, international legitimacy, and the Arab Peace Initiative. We have to spare no effort to put an end to the violence and the bloodletting. We have to ensure a better tomorrow for everyone. Therefore, we welcome all efforts to bring an end to all military operations and ensure the medical and humanitarian access to those affected in Gaza Strip. To conclude, Mr. President, the historical stance of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and its leaders throughout time remains in support of the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian people. It is principled on the fact that the Palestinian question is a vital and critical cause in the foreign affairs of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It will remain so. It's a vital axis in our policy until the Palestinian people regain their rights and their land, with the establishment of a Palestinian statehood along the lines of 1967 with East Jerusalem as its capital. Thank you.
I now give the floor to Her Excellency Linda Thomas Greenfield, Permanent Representative and Member of the Cabinet of the President of the United States. Good morning.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Secretary General Guterres, for your continued attention to this issue. Over the past 2 weeks, the United States has approached this crisis in Israel and Gaza with a singular focus: bringing an end to the conflict as quickly as possible. We have not been silent. In fact, I don't believe that there's any country working more urgently and more fervently toward peace. This is not a slight, and it is not silence. It's a fact I share to underscore our deep engagement and commitment to working with Israelis, Palestinians, and partners across the region to resolve this conflict. The United States has had more than 60 diplomatic meetings at the highest levels, including at least 5 by President Biden. In his most recent call with Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday, President Biden communicated that we continue to stand by Israel's right to defend itself, that we believe Israel is now in a position to begin winding down the conflict, and we expect a significant de-escalation to begin. In the hours and days ahead, we will continue to relentlessly push for peace. And we appreciate that so many nations have come together in this body to express the importance of resolving the conflict. The Security Council has met 4 times in the last 10 days on this topic, including an open debate over the weekend, to deliberate over the situation, particularly the suffering of civilians caught in the conflict by no fault of their own. Again, we've not been silent, and we hope that people across the region have heard us loud and clear. The United States calls on all parties to respect their obligations under international law, including with respect to the protection of civilians, medical facilities, and facilities that serve as civilian shelters. We continue to condemn rocket attacks by Hamas and other terrorist groups, and we stand against extremism that has led to violence against both communities. And we commend the tireless dedication and life-saving work of the UN and other humanitarian workers on the ground. We have to focus on making tangible progress toward peace. The United States will continue to champion every diplomatic effort that moves us closer to that goal. Israelis and Palestinians deserve safety and security and should enjoy equal measures of freedom, security, prosperity, and democracy. This requires that all parties return to working in good faith toward the vision of Israel and a Palestinian state, living side by side in peace and within secure and recognized borders. I would also encourage everyone participating today to take a hard look at how they are investing in the region. The needs in Gaza in particular are immense. We hope the international community will step up to meet the humanitarian needs on the ground, and this must be done in a manner that serves the needs of the Palestinians and not Hamas, which has time and time again failed the Palestinian people. The human toll of this violence has been heartbreaking. The stories of the families of children who've been killed, of those living with the trauma of surviving, are painful. We will never be silent in the face of such suffering. We are committed to working in concert with other members of this body to bring a rapid end to the current violence and over the long term, create the conditions for a lasting and sustainable peace. Thank you very much.
I thank the Permanent Representative and Member of the Cabinet of the President of the United States for her statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Mr. President, for convening us today. Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, the EU is deeply concerned over the situation in the Middle East. The priority has to be the immediate cessation of all violence and the implementation of a ceasefire in order to protect civilians and to provide full humanitarian access to Gaza. I want to express appreciation to you, Mr. Secretary General, and others who have been working to achieve this. The upsurge in violence in the last days has led to a high number of civilian deaths and injured, including a high number of children and women. This is unacceptable. The EU condemns the indiscriminate rocket attacks by Hamas and other terrorist groups on Israeli territory. We fully support Israel's right to self-defense. This has to be done in a proportionate manner and in full respect of international humanitarian law. In Jerusalem, the status quo of the holy sites must be fully respected and the right to worship upheld. The EU reiterates its strong opposition to Israel's settlement policy and actions taken in this context. It will be important now not to proceed with the evictions in Sheikh Jarrah. Looking ahead, real security for Israel and Palestine requires a true political solution that will bring peace. In order to achieve this outcome, we need to restore a political horizon, explore the space for meaningful re-engagement between the parties, develop confidence-building measures, improve living conditions for ordinary people, and open the path towards the potential relaunch of the peace process. In this context, the holding of Palestinian elections, including in East Jerusalem, must be considered a priority. To this end, the EU will renew its engagement with key international partners, including the United States, and partners in the region, as well as with the revived Middle East Quartet. I thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sweden on behalf of the Nordic countries.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies and colleagues, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and my own country, Sweden. We welcome the opportunity for the General Assembly to meet amid the most serious escalations in Israel and Palestine in years. We also welcome the last meetings in the Security Council on the matter. We urge the Council to shoulder its responsibility and act according to its mandate. We support efforts of Norway, Tunisia, and China, and also France in this regard, as well as the engagement from the neighboring countries, the Quartet, the European Union, and the United States in seeking an immediate de-escalation of the conflict. Mr. President, as the Secretary General has pointed out, the last round of violence only perpetuates a cycle of despair and makes hope of, and not least the major upsurge in violence from and in Gaza must stop immediately. A ceasefire must be reached without any delay. Mr. President, we continue to strongly condemn the indiscriminate and recurrent firing of rockets into each time. We underline that the response must be in accordance with international law and that the obligation of international humanitarian law, including the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution, must be strictly observed. We are appalled by the civilian lives already lost, especially the large number of children. all children in Gaza was already serious before the escalation. It is now acute and deteriorating. Humanitarian access must be ensured in line with international humanitarian law. We commend the pivotal humanitarian role that UNRWA is playing, and we urge donors to support the organizations and other humanitarian actors. We must address the root causes of the conflict. It needs to facilitate concrete steps towards a realization of the two-state solution and ending the occupation. As we have recently witnessed, continued settlement spark an increase in violence and unrest. The recurring cycle of violence must be broken. We must draw lessons from the current events. Moreover, the risk of regional escalation must be taken seriously. Leaders must act in responsible manners and raise their voice against incitement. The road itself needs to, once again, be paved. The international community needs to remobilize its efforts to create a credible process towards a two-state solution based on international law, with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security and mutual recognition. We stand ready to contribute accordingly. Let me conclude, Mr. President, by voicing our support to the EU statement, and I thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sweden. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Comoros on behalf of the African Group.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Mr. President of the General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General of the United Nations, Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, for convening this timely and important meeting. I also extend my profound thanks to the permanent representative of Niger and the permanent representative of Algeria in their capacities as the chair of the IOC and the Arab Group, respectively, for requesting a meeting of the General Assembly to hold a debate on agenda items 37, entitled The Situation in the Middle East, and 38, entitled Question over the Situation in the Occupied Territories and in Israel, following the clashes in the occupied East Jerusalem, including Al-Aqsa Mosque, Al-Haram al-Sharif, and in Sheikh Jarrah during the month of Ramadan. The Israeli airstrikes on Gaza have claimed more. The airstrikes have dramatically deteriorated an already fragile situation. The cost of civilian population is unbearable and unacceptable. The clashes have led to the displacement of over 58,000 Palestinians, many of whom are seeking refuge in UN relief and works agency schools across Gaza. We are also concerned about the lasting effects of COVID-19 amongst vulnerable people huddled in crowded shelters, and that it upholds its obligation under the international human rights law and the international humanitarian law. I further call upon the international community to shoulder its responsibilities by providing protection to the civilians and access to humanity, to take concrete steps to bring an end to the violence. In this regard, I echo the Secretary General calls for the parties to stop the bombardments and the launching of rockets, because these acts have brought nothing but death, destruction, and widespread trauma throughout the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel. We should intensify our efforts to find a just and lasting solution to the conflict based on the two-state solution, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and harmony within the framework of the relevant African Union and United Nations pronouncements. But this must start with urgent action towards ending the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian land. Mr. President, Excellencies, the African support to the Palestinian cause is premised on the values of freedom, justice, and humanitarian principles that Africa defends in the international fora, alongside all those striving to ensure that Palestine regains its right to exist as a key viable state in the Middle East. Africa has consistently expressed deep concerns at the consequences of unilateral policies, actions, and provocations, including the ongoing lockdown on Gaza Strip. In conclusion, we call upon the UN General Assembly, the Security Council, the Quartet of the Middle East, and the Secretary General of the United Nations to resolutely commit to end this situation and to relaunch the peace process to find a just and lasting solution to the conflict that would establish a sovereign Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital in accordance with the relevant United Nations resolutions. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Comoros. I'll now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Azerbaijan on behalf of the non-aligned movement.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, I deliver this statement on behalf of the Coordination Bureau of the Non-Aligned Movement. At the outset, we would like to thank you for convening this debate under Agenda Item 37, the situation in the Middle East, and 38, question of Palestine, upon the request from delegations of Niger and Algeria, respectively, as the chair of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the chair of the Arab Group, to which Coordinating Bureau also joined, and for the opportunity to present the position on the question of Palestine that has historically constituted an issue of deep concern and vital importance to the movement. The non-aligned movement considers with gravest concerns recent developments and the dangerous deterioration of the situation in the occupied Palestine territory, including East Jerusalem. The movement condemns, in the strongest terms, acts of aggression by Israeli occupying power against the Palestinian civilian population, including attacks on Palestinian worshippers at Al-Aqsa Mosque in occupied East Jerusalem that have wounded hundreds of people over recent days, leaving many in critical conditions, and the launching on May 10th of an Israeli military aggression against the Gaza Strip that has killed at least 245 Palestinians, including 68 children and 37 women, and wounded more than 1,500 civilians. Attacks by Israeli forces have also caused vast destruction of homes and vital civilian infrastructure, including schools, medical centers, and electricity network, and have displaced more than 38,000 people who are now sheltering in 47 UNRWA schools, fleeing their homes in fear in this time of pandemic. NAM calls for the immediate cessation of this Israeli military aggression in all its manifestations and calls for urgent protection of the Palestinian civilian population in accordance with international law and the relevant UN resolutions, including inter alia resolution ES 10/20 of the 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly. Mr. President, the non-aligned movement reaffirms its abiding solidarity with the Palestinian people and its unwavering support for their unalienable rights, including to self-determination, which they unjustly continue to be deprived of, yet steadfastly continue to seek. The movement continues to appeal and affirms its support for all efforts to achieve a just, lasting, and peaceful solution to the question of Palestine in line with international law, the UN Charter, and relevant UN resolutions. Recalling the relevant decisions of the ministerial and summit meetings, as well as declarations of the non-aligned movement, including the communique issued on May 13, 2021, the movement reiterates its demands for an immediate halt of this military aggression and all acts of violence, provocation, and incitement, including by extremist Israeli settlers, and calls for scrupulous respect by Israel of international law, including humanitarian human rights law in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. The occupying power must also seize all other human rights violations against the Palestinian civilian population, many of which may amount to war crimes, including the massive collective punishment of 2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, The illegal and inhuman blockade of Gaza must be completely lifted. Israel must fully comply with its duties and responsibilities under international law, including its legal obligations under the Fourth Geneva Convention as the occupying power without exceptions. As demanded by international law and countless UN resolutions, Israel must also immediately cease all policies and measures aimed at the alteration of the demography, character, identity, and legal status of the occupied territory, including East Jerusalem, including all settlement activities, seizure of Palestine land and properties, demolition of Palestinian homes, expulsion of forced displacement of Palestinian families, including the Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan areas of East Jerusalem, among other places, and the transfer of its settlers. This action constitutes grave breaches of international law and cannot be justified under any means. It must also cease its provocations and incitement, including targeting holy sites, and must respect the historic and legal status quo Al-Aqsa Mosque, Al-Haram al-Sharif, right of Muslims to worship there in peace, free from harassment, intimidation, and attacks. The non-aligned movement reaffirms all Security Council and General Assembly resolutions relating to Jerusalem and confirming that it is an integral part of the occupied Palestinian territory. Member states of the movement call upon the Security Council to uphold its responsibilities for the maintenance of international peace and security, and to act urgently to escalate this volatile situation and demand a cessation of violence and all illegal actions and provocations, and to ensure respect for international law and the Council's relevant resolutions, including Resolution 2334 and all provisions concerning Jerusalem. The movement calls for action to ensure accountability for all violations perpetrated by Israel against the Palestinian people. Israel's continued non-compliance with the law warrants collective action in line with obligations under international law, including Common Article 1 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, to respect and ensure respect of the Convention in all its circumstances. Non-aligned movement stresses once again that respect for the Charter, international law, and United Nations resolutions constitutes the foundation for a just solution of the Palestine question, the cornerstone for regional and global peace and security. The movement reiterates its calls upon the international community to exert all necessary efforts to promote the realization of a just, lasting, and peaceful solution based on the internationally endorsed parameters enshrined in the relevant UN resolutions, and stands ready to engage with and support initiatives on this basis. The international community must translate its long-standing principled positions and commitments into urgent action. The non-aligned movement also reiterates its call for the continued provision of the needed humanitarian and socio-economic assistance to the Palestinian people, including the Palestinian refugees. In this regard, the movement calls for urgently needed funding for support UNRWA and its capacity to provide the needed assistance to the Palestinian refugees, including those tragically displaced once again from their homes in the Gaza Strip. UNRWA already faces a funding shortfall, constraining its stability to meet needs which have now been exacerbated by the senseless devastation to families and destruction to homes and properties caused yet again by another Israeli military aggression. The non-aligned movement appeals to the international community for humanitarian compassion and ensure that emergency food, hygiene, medical, and shelter needs are met through support to UNRWA, UNICEF, and other United Nations agencies active in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. Mr. President, in conclusion, the non-aligned movement reiterates its call for an immediate end of the Israeli aggression and an end to its illegal 54-year military occupation, as well as the restoration of justice and rights to Palestinian people. The movement reaffirms its strong support and solidarity with the just cause of Palestine and its commitment to continue supporting the Palestinian people in their quest for achieve their inalienable rights and legitimate national aspirations, including their right to return and their right to self-determination, freedom and independence in their state of Palestine, with East Jerusalem as its capital, which is absolutely vital for justice to prevail and for the realization of a just, comprehensive, and sustainable peace. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Azerbaijan. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Secretary General, let me remind you of what many of you unfortunately ignore. Hamas is an internationally designated jihadi terrorist organization that has fired more than 4,000 rockets at Israeli cities over the last 11 days. Right now, as I speak to you, Israeli civilians are running to find shelter from Hamas's indiscriminate attacks. Here is a quote from the Hamas charter. Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it just as it obliterated others before it. And it continues, the day of judgment will not come until Muslims fight the Jews and kill them. Now let me remind you of another charter, one that some of you seem to have forgotten, the UN Charter, which was formulated in the wake of the horrors of the World War II and the Nazi genocide of the Jewish people. The Charter of the UN calls to, and I quote, reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, practice tolerance, and maintain international peace and security. Sadly, in today's debate, we are not seeing a defense of the goals laid out for the UN, but rather an indifference to Hamas's charter, which, like the Nazis, is committed to the genocide of the Jewish people. We see an attempt to create a false moral equivalence, an immoral equivalence between Israel, a democracy that seeks peace and abides by international law, and a murderous terrorist organization with an ideology similar to ISIS that is carrying out the double war crime of firing at Israeli civilians while hiding its weapons behind Palestinian civilians, using them as human shields. This is what today's debate should be about. It is about who takes steps to support the values of the UN Charter and who takes steps to ignore the values of the Hamas Charter. It is about who is on the side of extremism and hate and who is on the side of moderation and dialogue. It is about who has the moral courage to support a democracy fighting radical terrorists and who has sunk to such depth of moral depravity that they equate between the two. Every speaker here today that fails to unequivocally condemn Hamas, that fails to distinguish between Hamas's war crimes and Israel's self-defense, that chooses to demonize Israel rather than supporting its heroic efforts to dismantle Hamas's terrorist infrastructure is only strengthening extremist forces, encouraging terrorist groups to use civilians as human shields, and undermining the chances for peace. For years now, Hamas has held Israeli citizens and the bodies of our soldiers hostage. It is outrageous that you not only fail to call Hamas a terror organization, but you also refuse to demand that our sons are returned to their families. Mr. President, it is really quite remarkable. You know, usually, as we all here know, the UN works slowly, very, very slowly. It took the General Assembly a few months to convene a discussion on the fight against COVID-19, from which millions around the world have died. But when it comes to holding a debate to pressure Israel and give a terrorist organization a free pass, you were able to convene after only 11 days. What a disgrace. Is this what the UN was established for? Are those your priorities? These debates in the General Assembly are always characterized by deception and lies. So let me share some simple but critical truths. Hamas targets civilians. Israel targets terrorists. Israel makes every effort to avoid civilian casualties. Hamas makes every effort to increase civilian casualties, Israelis and Palestinians, by the way. Israel uses its missiles to protect its children. Hamas uses its children to protect its missiles. Hamas's rockets are indiscriminate by design. They have struck Jewish towns, Arab cities, and Bedouin villages. They have killed Jewish and Muslim Israelis. They have killed not just Israelis, but Indian and Thai citizens. And they have killed numerous innocent Gazan children and destroyed Gazan homes. Mr. President, are you aware that out of every 100 rockets fired by Hamas at Israel, approximately 25 fall on Gaza, spreading death and destruction among Hamas's own people? So while Hamas rockets are indiscriminate, Israel's strikes are precise, surgical. We go above and beyond the demands of international law. How many militaries warn civilians with phone calls and text messages to evacuate buildings hiding terror centers in order to avoid collateral damage? Yet, despite our greatest efforts, Hamas's cynical ploy of building a subterranean terror metro beneath schools, maternity wards, and mosques in order to cause the death of civilians, sadly, works. But we must not forget, Hamas is to blame for those fatalities as well. As an Israeli and as a Jew, I am deeply, deeply pained by every civilian casualty. But while Israel sees every civilian death as a tragedy, Hamas sees every Israeli civilian death as a victory in its campaign of jihad, and every Palestinian civilian death as a victory in its propaganda campaign. I have heard voices in this hall accusing Israel of a disproportionate response based on the different number of Israeli and Palestinian casualties. Well, if the UN General Assembly existed during the Nazi regime, would it have held a special session to condemn the Allies for their disproportionate response and the large number of German casualties? Would it have urged them to show restraint in the face of Hitler, the Nazi army, and their supporters? I don't think so. Did the General Assembly hold an emergency debate to condemn coalition forces for acting disproportionately in their fight against ISIS? You and everyone around the world know the answer to that question. And let me be clear. This is not a war between Israel and the people of Gaza. No. This is not a war between Israel and the Palestinians. This is a war only between Israel and Hamas. We will never apologize for defending our citizens, even if some of the countries here might be happy to see a greater number of dead Jews. Mr. President, these are the facts. And here is one more critical fact that you should take into account as you choose which side of history you will be on today. The massive, unprovoked Hamas assault had nothing to do with the legal dispute in Sheikh Jarrah or the situation in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Nothing. In fact, during this Ramadan and throughout the year, like every year, hundreds of thousands of Muslims prayed peacefully at Al-Aqsa Mosque. Israel's police were forced to enter the Temple Mount only after Hamas encouraged Palestinian extremists to store weapons at the holy site and to desecrate its sanctity by turning it into a launching pad for attacks on Jewish worshippers and on the police. Look at this photograph. Is this the way to treat a sensitive holy site? Who undermined the holiness of this site? The police that worked to restore order and to quickly reopen the site for prayers? Or the rioters who repeatedly launched violent attacks? You all know, and you know what? Even the Palestinian representative here today knows that Hamas's premeditated assault had nothing to do with any Israeli action. None. This was all the result of Hamas's frustration with President Abbas's decision to cancel the election and its desire to increase its political influence in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Hamas seeks to replace the Palestinian Authority and take control of the Palestinian territories. So after the elections were canceled, again, by the way, it decided to launch a war of aggression against Israel. Suddenly, Hamas leader Mohammed Deif, who has been silent for years, was threatening Israel would pay a heavy price if an Israeli court went ahead and ruled on a property dispute in Jerusalem. Have you asked yourself why the Hamas leadership in Gaza would be commenting on a legal dispute in Jerusalem that has been going on for years? This was all a part of Hamas's strategy to gain political power. You all know that Israel did everything to de-escalate the situation. Our efforts were met with rockets on Jerusalem, rockets on our capital. You cannot fire at our capital and then pretend you want a ceasefire. Israel wants a ceasefire, but only after significantly degrading Hamas's terror machine. We are looking for a cure and not a band-aid. And yet, you have once again been calling on Israel to exercise restraint when facing hundreds of indiscriminate attacks every day. Every day. Let me ask you a question. What would you do if it was you? If it was your civilians under fire? If it was your family running to the bomb shelters? How would you want the international community to respond? Would you be responding differently if jihadi terrorists were firing thousands of rockets at Istanbul or Tripoli? Think about it. Would you be calling on both sides to show restraint if rockets were destroying homes in Copenhagen and Paris? I don't think so. The hypocrisy in this institution knows no boundaries. I will tell you what you wouldn't do. You wouldn't accept attempts by the General Assembly to make the immoral comparison between a state which sanctifies life and a terrorist group which glorifies death. Despite the hypocrisy in institutional bias here at the UN and the acquiescence of Hamas's actions, an organization which, may I remind you, celebrated the terror attacks of 9/11 and mourned the death of bin Laden, the State of Israel will take all steps necessary to protect its civilians, while making every effort to avoid harming Palestinian civilians. I thank all the countries that have expressed their support for Israel's right to self-defense. First and foremost, President Biden and the American administration. Mr. President, just as Israel will always defend our civilians against terror, we will always work to advance peace. Just this year, we signed 4 peace agreements with Muslim countries, and we are so proud of it. We made painful concessions for peace with Egypt and Jordan, and 6 Israeli prime ministers were ready to make painful concessions in the past to reach peace with our Palestinian neighbors. In 2005, we uprooted and removed every Jewish home in the Gaza Strip because some thought that it would bring calm. Instead, ever since Hamas seized power over the Gaza Strip, we have experienced unending terror. In 2007, when Hamas violently took control over the Gaza Strip, its militants threw their Palestinian brothers, Fatah members, off rooftops and cheered as the bodies fell. I hope today that you do not choose to throw the chances for peace from the rooftop and pat yourself on the back as extremism triumphs. Hamas doesn't accept Israel's right to exist. It refuses to renounce violence and refuses to acknowledge past agreements. Those are the quartet's 3 principles. There should be no mistake. If this institution strengthens Hamas, it will make the possibility of Hamas replacing the Palestinian Authority much more likely and eliminate the chance of future dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians. There is nothing to discuss with a terror organization committed to your annihilation. Nothing. So don't say we didn't warn you. Mr. President, the demonization of Israel in the international arena, spurred by members of this assembly, such as Turkey, who are using anti-Semitic tropes, is encouraging sickening anti-Semitic attacks all around the world. The Turkish leadership is in no position to preach to Israel, by the way, or anyone else, about human rights or the military harming innocent civilians. The State of Israel will never stay silent in the face of such anti-Semitic attacks. Never has there been a clearer example of the fact that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. So today, we call on all governments to take swift and effective action to protect their Jewish communities, apprehend the perpetrators, and ensure that Jewish citizens everywhere can live proud and open Jewish lives. Mr. President, in the face of those here who have chosen the values of the Hamas Charter over the values of the UN Charter, I stand here as a proud representative of the State of Israel. The state founded upon the 4,000-year-old connection between the land of Israel and the Jewish people. The state which rose from the ashes of the Holocaust to ensure that the Jewish people will never be defenseless. I stand here and declare, never again. The State of Israel will always do whatever is necessary to defend our people, and we will do so while continuing to protect human lives and aspiring to peace with all of our neighbors. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Israel. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mexico.
Señor
Mr. President, Deputy Secretary General, we thank you for convening this debate. The General Assembly of the United Nations is the multilateral forum par excellence. Today we come here to express our profound consternation at the ongoing worsening of the situation in the Middle East. We cannot ignore, whilst we are meeting here, that the number of civilian victims is increasing both in Israel as well as in the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly in Gaza. It is very unfortunate that in just a few days the tragic outcome of the clashes has been hundreds of civilians. Mexico rejects the civilian population being placed in the situation of insecurity, be it Palestine or... Despite the fact that the situation on the ground is worsening day by day, we regret that the Security Council has still been unable to take a position. We hope that the Council will be able to rise to the occasion. What we need to do is put an end to violence, the violence that we've seen in recent days, and urgently call for the protection of the civilian population for respect of international law. Human mediation, both bilateral as well as multilateral, should be welcome. Far from being exclusive measures, they are complementary. Mexico supports will also insist in the Security Council, as we have done from the very first time that we began to analyze this conflict, that the Council must take a position in accordance with its mandate. We are also concerned to see the inter-community violence in various Israeli worship are deplorable under any circumstances. Jerusalem must maintain its special status in accordance with United Nations resolutions, and it must be a place of harmonious coexistence and demographic composition of East Jerusalem. The transfer of population, the seizure of property, the demolitions, the forced evictions, and nations' resolutions, including Resolution 2334. For this reason, they are unacceptable. We reiterate our condemnation of the disproportionate use of force in the... Likewise, we also robustly condemn the attacks by rockets and incendiary devices launched by Hamas and other organizations from Gaza against Israel. Mexico reaffirms its commitment to a comprehensive and lasting solution on the basis of two states, which addresses the legitimate security concern viable, two states living within secure and internationally recognized borders. Although the direct responsibility for resuming the peace process falls on the parties to the conflict, the international community must drive forward and facilitate this process. Cessation of hostilities what we need is a ceasefire. This has been called for on many occasions by the Secretary General. We believe that the United Nations can and must play a more active role in this area. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Mexico. And now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative.
يشرفني أن ألقي هذه الكلمة.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to deliver this statement. I quote, Mr. Secretary General, Mr. President of the General Assembly, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank the President of the General Assembly for his initiative, Antonio Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General, for his efforts. He has made sincere efforts to put an end to the tension and escalation in the occupied Palestinian territory. Once again, and for the same reasons, serious acts of violence have led to the deaths and injuries of hundreds of people, has increased the suffering and now constitutes a direct threat to regional and international peace and security. Unfortunately, what we are witnessing in terms of the increase in violence is the inevitable result of this situation against the Palestinian people, the increase in hate speech belonging to extremist groups. We warned against these destructive practices, that represented for the prospects for peace and the risk they represented of increasing the conflict, and there were not clear intentions to bring an end to it. His Majesty the King, as the President of the Al-Quds Committee of the OIC, has continued to reiterate that undermining the legal historic status in holy places, attempts to impose an illegal exodus on the inhabitants of Sheikh Jarrah is unacceptable and must end for peace and stability. His Majesty also reiterated that it is necessary to avoid anything widen the gap between Palestinians and Israelis and would hamper the peace process. He thus stressed the need to preserve the holy city, given that the Pope on the 30th of March 2019, the Kingdom of Morocco reiterated its commitment to a just, peace, independent, sovereign, viable Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital within the June 1967 borders. We therefore call upon the international community, in particular the Quartet and the Security Council, to seriously begin work to end the escalation and the reasons for the escalation, and to bring an end to this cycle of violence, and to redouble diplomatic efforts to revitalize its assistance to the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank in order to overcome these dramatic conditions. The Kingdom of Morocco, under the orders of His Majesty the King, basic foodstuffs, medicines, and covers to try to mitigate the dire circumstances in the current situation. This royal decision is part of the sustained support from the Kingdom for the just Palestinian cause and its continued solidarity with the brotherly Palestinian people. This is all part of the work of His Majesty the King as the chair of the Al-Quds Committee. This combines political and diplomatic work with work on the ground, such as the work of the Beit al-Mal agency's work, which is the executive field branch of the Al-Quds Committee under the personal supervision of His Majesty for the inhabitants of Jerusalem so that they can live in dignity and to build their capacities. The Kingdom of Morocco, which is committed to the choice of peace, will make every necessary effort with the stakeholders to manage to bring an end to the escalation and to reinvigorate peace in the region. In conclusion, we remain convinced of the centrality of the Palestinian question and peace. This must be at the top of the international community's priorities. This is the position of all countries, and we reiterate that at every opportunity, convinced as we are that stability and lasting peace in the Middle East is a strategic choice. Achieving a just and lasting solution in the context of international law and resolutions of the Security Council, and allowing all peoples of the region to live in peace and security. End quote. Thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Morocco, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Madam President, in the last couple of weeks, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has escalated to its most severe state in recent years. China expresses grave concerns over the development and urges the international community to take urgent actions to end the current crisis and prevent the situation from falling out of control across the board. The Security Council bears the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. Since the outbreak of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, this time, as President of the Council for this month, China has worked closely with Council members, overcome difficulties, and held 4 Council meetings, and proposed a draft President statement to urge parties to cease hostilities and ease the tensions as soon as possible. The State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi on May 16th presided over a Council's open emergency meeting on the Israeli and Palestinian conflict to stay committed to the Council's role to end the current crisis. Both the Palestine and Israel and the relevant regional organizations and countries attended the meeting. The meeting sent out a strong message. A great majority of Council members called for the immediate cessation of hostilities, demanded civilian protection measures, supported a just solution to the question of Palestine on the basis of the two-state solution, and supported the Council in fulfilling its charter duties. China commends the great majority of Council members and for their efforts, and urges the relevant member to demonstrate its sense of responsibility. Despite the difficulties, China will continue to support the Council in taking actions, remaining united and speaking with one voice so as to work with the international community in an unrelenting effort to end the current crisis and find a just solution to the Palestinian question. In view of the current situation, China has the following proposals. First, cease hostilities and violence immediately to avoid more civilian casualties. Days of conflicts have caused heavy casualties of Palestinian civilians, including many women and children, some as young as several months old. There are also casualties among Israeli civilians. These are all very saddening. Use of force cannot produce a fundamental solution. To pay violence for violence will only beget more hatred. China condemns all violence against civilians, opposes all violence inciting rhetoric, and calls for the immediate end of hostilities and violence. Israel in particular should exercise restraint. Facts have repeatedly shown that no so-called precise strike can avoid civilian casualties. China supports the United Nations, relevant regional organizations, and countries in their diplomatic and mediation efforts for an early ceasefire. Second, earnestly implement UN resolutions and protect legitimate rights and interests of Palestinian people. Building settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories in violation of international law gravely undermines the prospect of a two-state solution. The issue of settlement is one of the core topics for the Palestinian question's final status negotiation. It must be properly solved before the two sides can improve mutual trust and the Middle East process can break free from a vicious circle. China calls on Israel, in line with the UN resolutions, to stop building settlements in occupied Palestinian land, stop eviction of Palestinian families, halt the demolition of Palestinian houses, suppress violence against Palestinians, and earnestly protect legitimate rights and interests of Palestinian people in the occupied territories. The historical status quo of holy sites in Jerusalem's Old City must be maintained and respected. Third, take robust measures to prevent humanitarian disasters. The mutually compounding effects of conflict, pandemic, and blockade have further aggravated the very fragile humanitarian situation in Gaza, as reflected in power shortage, lack of medical resources, and mass displacement of civilians. China calls upon conflict parties to observe international humanitarian law, stop attacking civilian facilities, especially hospitals and schools, and cease military operations in civilian areas. Israel should lift the blockade on Gaza and facilitate the access of humanitarian supplies to the area immediately. The conflict has led to the destruction of many civilian houses in Gaza. The international community should step up its reconstruction support for Gaza and relieve local communities' hardships. Fourth, redouble the efforts to promote peace talks and a two-state solution. The root causes of the repeated eruption of conflict between Palestine and Israel is the fact that the Middle East peace process has been off track and UN resolutions are not effectively implemented. Particularly, Palestine's right to independent statehood has been persistently infringed upon, and two-state solution is yet a reality on the ground. 70 years on, an independent state remains an unrealized dream for Palestinian people. China supports all efforts conducive to the realization of a two-state solution. To this end, the international community, especially countries with influence on the parties, should play an active role. As a sincere friend of the Palestinian people, China firmly supports Palestine's just demand and supports establishment of a fully sovereign, independent Palestinian state by its people on the basis of 1967 borders and with East Jerusalem as its capital. We will continue to make efforts for this end. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of China, and now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Niger.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, ministers and heads of delegation, On behalf of the Minister of State, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Niger, His Excellency Hassoumi Massoudou Ampeshe, who was not able to attend, I would like to express my thanks to the President of the General Assembly, Mr. Volkan Bozkır, for having convened this meeting to allow us to consider the dire situation in the past few days in the occupied Palestinian territories. Niger, the acting president of the Conference of the Ministers of Foreign Affairs of the OIC, is delighted to share the initiative of convening this important meeting with Algeria, which is the chair of the Arab group, to allow for this, to allow this representative body to have its voice heard over the open-air tragedy that is taking place in occupied Palestine. We thank the non-aligned movement for having associated itself with this as well. I welcome the participation of several ministers who have travelled here despite the difficult conditions linked to the pandemic to participate in the first major meeting of the General Assembly in the COVID-19 era in person, and it is an eloquent testimony of their commitment to the purposes and principles of the Charter that are being so trampled in occupied Palestine. Through his presence, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres, is demonstrating his constant commitment to finding a solution to this crisis. Mr. President, for my country, Niger, defending the ideals and principles of the United Nations Charter is not an option. It is an imperative, the respect of which guarantees the peace and security of each person and every state, small or large. The dire situation in Palestine due to the Israeli occupation is for all of us a test of our will to respect the values that lie at the heart of our organization. In the face of the blockage within the Security Council, which following 4 meetings has not been able to speak out on the serious events that are underway, the General Assembly is well within its role to, given the ongoing violence, to call for the sparing of human lives, the end to a destruction of infrastructure, and the growing gap between Israelis and Palestinians. Let us not be afraid of saying so. The violence in the last few days is the direct consequence of the continuing settlement building policy of Palestinian lands conducted by Israel for more than 54 years. This policy of intimidation, provocation, and repression of all forms against the population, in particular East Jerusalem, due to the actions of the Israeli security forces and extremist settlers, particularly during the holy month of Ramadan, has unquestionably been the trigger of the uprising that we are witnessing now. As it did in the Council, my delegation unreservedly condemns these Israeli actions, the actions of the occupying power, its refusal to respect international law and international humanitarian law. Madam President, no one would question Israel's right to protect and defend itself as though it were Israeli territory that is being occupied. Equally, no one could demand or envisage that defenseless people living under the yoke of a ferocious occupation would resign themselves to not responding, given the inertia and inaction of the international community that is nevertheless supposed to defend and protect them. In the face of this emergency, we should call for an immediate cessation of hostilities by demanding the end of bombardments of Palestinian civilians, bombardments which, alas, are not sparing refugee camps or schools, nor United Nations offices, let alone those buildings that house the press. Civilians must be protected regardless of where they come from, their race or their religion, in accordance with international humanitarian law and the relevant resolutions of the Security Council pertaining to their protection in conflict. Similarly, rocket launches against Israel in response to the bombings must end in order to give peace a chance. The peace that has been pursued since Oslo does not just mean ending the current hostilities. We have an obligation to resolve the problem at its root. We therefore welcome the intense diplomatic efforts being made by the United Nations through the Special Coordinator, Mr. Tor Vennesland, the Quartet for the Middle East Peace Process, and the other pertinent actors to bring an end to the hostilities so as to give the civilian population some respite, the civilian population that have been caught in the trap of this latest conflagration of violence. Just as you can't treat an illness by only dealing with the symptoms, we won't be able to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian crisis by simply ending the current spate of violence, as has been the case several times in the past. The true solution will be to bring Israel to put an end to its settlement building activity of Palestinian territories, and the true solution will be to have the courage to create conditions to bring about an independent and viable Palestinian state within its 1967 borders, living side by side with Israel and with East Jerusalem as its capital in accordance with the relevant resolutions of the Security Council and the General Assembly. Long years of waiting, of unfulfilled promises, of hoping in vain, moves the two-state solution further away, particularly when Israel's actions will ultimately make it unviable with its pursuit of a policy of balkanizing the Palestinian territories under the guise of confiscating and illegally occupying Palestinian territories. Madam President, the humanitarian situation in the Palestinian territories is also a source of major concern. The destruction of buildings hosting public services, schools, hospitals, and media and communication outlets will have a major impact on the provision of basic services to the population. Similarly, it will hinder the efforts that are being made to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. My delegation therefore calls for proper support for UNRWA to strengthen its ability to address the pressing needs of the population that has been made even more vulnerable by the current crisis. We welcome the efforts that have been made by the ICRC, UNICEF, and the entirety of the humanitarian family, whose teams are working at the risk of their own lives to save other lives. To conclude, my delegation hopes that our meeting today will help bring an end to this dangerous escalation. We must do everything that we can to ensure that justice, peace, and liberty triumph. We must have the courage to create the conditions to bring about an independent and viable Palestinian state in accordance with the relevant resolutions of the Security Council and the General Assembly. The peoples of this wonderful region, that is the crossroads of the three great monotheistic religions, are watching us. The world is also watching us, and we must not and we cannot fail in our historic responsibility to help them. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Niger. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
Madam President, I welcome amongst us the presence of several ministers. The situation in the Middle East is serious. As we meet, the fighting continues. Civilians on both sides are the primary victims. This conflict could lead to a general outbreak of violence that would have serious consequences for the Palestinians in Israel and have regional repercussions. Today we must silence the guns. France supports the call of the Secretary General for an immediate cessation of hostilities. The human cost in Gaza is increasing. They are already sorely tested by a blockade that has lasted far too long, and there is suffering in Israel. We condemn robustly the firing of rockets by Hamas and other terrorist groups against the inhabitants of Israel. These indiscriminate attacks are contrary to international humanitarian law and must cease. The support of France to the security of Israel is unfailing. We call upon the Israeli authorities to show the greatest restraint and to act in a proportionate manner with all the necessary precautions and in strict respect for international law. We call upon everyone to protect civilians, particularly children, and to guarantee immediate access and unhindered access to humanitarian aid to respond to the urgent needs of the population, particularly those that have been displaced. France also calls for the protection of staff and infrastructure, humanitarian and medical infrastructure in accordance with international humanitarian law, and also for protection of journalists. Their security in times of conflict is essential if we are to be informed. The escalation that we are seeing once again, and we've seen over the last 10 days, is part of a context of which we're very well aware. An absence of a political perspective and non-respect for international law for so many years now. The cycles of violence will continue if there's no willingness to move towards the establishment of two states living in peace and security within safe borders that are recognized and based on the lines of the 4th of June 1967, each of them having Jerusalem as their capital in the framework of international law and Security Council resolutions. The commitment of the international community to peace in the Middle East must be total. As long as this conflict has not been solved politically, we will see violence reoccur. And it is the Palestinian and Israeli populations each time that will pay the price. The Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs, Jean-Yves Le Drian, has recalled this to the international community when he spoke with his German, Egyptian and Jordanian colleagues in Paris on the 11th of March. In the following weeks, France expressed its serious concern with regard to the evictions of Palestinian families in East Jerusalem, particularly in Sheikh Jarrah, by the pursuance of settlement activity, because illegal settlements, these are settlements that are illegal under international law, and they worsen tensions. We also recalled the need for respect for the status quo of 1967 with regard to the holy sites, particularly with regard to Jordan and its specific role in this regard. All of these calls for hatred and violence must cease in order to bring peace to Palestine and Israel. Today, the fighting must stop as soon as possible. France wishes that the Security Council will assume its responsibility under the Charter. It is its primary role in this crisis, as well as any other crisis that relates to international peace and security. What is at stake here are human lives. This is why the initiative of President Macron, together with President Sisi and King Abdallah II, France presented to the members of the Security Council yesterday a draft resolution which follows on from all of the efforts of other Council members over the last few days. This resolution asks for three things that should be subject to consensus: an immediate cessation of hostilities, the respect for international humanitarian law and the protection of civilians, as well as the urgent resumption of negotiations in order to implement the two-state solution. It recalls our condemnation of indiscriminate rocket attacks and violations of international law. This initiative, of course, is complementary to other initiatives to bring a cessation of hostilities and a lasting ceasefire. These efforts, and I think of those of several of our partners, particularly the bilateral commitment of the United Nations, as well as the steps taken by Egypt, we support them, of course, and we actively contribute to them. France therefore calls upon the members of the Security Council in a complementary way to other individual efforts and in accordance with the powers of the Council to act responsibly. More than 2 weeks after the outbreak of the cycle of violence, we now have to act for multilateralism and to ensure a peaceful settlement of disputes. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of France, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lebanon.
Madam President, Madam Deputy Secretary General, Amina, the Bible tells us that for everything there is a season and time, a time for war and a time for peace. For the Palestinians, it has been only one season, a time for war and a time of loss and pain for decades. The latest Israeli assault on Gaza, dubbed Guardians of the Gate, is upon the Palestinians, with all its pain and destruction. The aim of this latest assault, as Israeli Prime Minister put it, is to restore deterrence and prevent future conflict. Madam President, what's happening is a recipe for future conflicts. To prove it, I'll call you to recall the 7 Israeli major operations, military operations, that Israel undertook against Gaza since 2006, with the aim of creating deterrence. All Israeli operations start the same and ended with the same pain and suffering. They turned Gaza into a large prison of 2 million people and cost thousands of lives, with more thousands injured, homes destroyed, while whole families perished, schools and hospitals targeted, buildings turned into rubble, but they never succeeded in silencing the Palestinians. From the first military operation in 2006, Summer Rains, it's called, to the second operation, Autumn Clouds, in 2006 also, to the start of the blockade of Gaza in 2007, to Hot Winter Operation in 2008, to Cast Lead in 2008 also, to Returning Echo 2012, to Protective Edge 2014, to killing the protesters on the border of Gaza in 2018, and to now the Guardians of the Gate. In this operation, the situation in Gaza is grave, with over 230 Palestinians killed, 63 of them are children, and 40 are women, with thousands injured and over 50,000 people reported displaced. Madam President, nothing can guard against a people who are determined to defend their homes, and no deterrence will work in the face of a people who want to break free. Like all the other operations before, the fight will end with a ceasefire probably, but it will not end the conflict, because this is not about rockets and weapons and ceasefires. It is about occupation and self-determination. It's also about a holy city, Jerusalem, the key to peace in our time and in all time. Jerusalem, the city of peace, is what brought things to a head, because the Palestinians feel that it is slipping from their hands one neighborhood at a time to the occupation. That's why May 2021 saw the Palestinians, all the Palestinians everywhere, rise to defend themselves, and the latest attack on their rights in the city and its holy places, when the Israeli army entered the Haram Sharif, the third most sacred place in Islam, during the holy month of Ramadan, and attacked the worshippers inside the mosque. The Palestinian anger did not come from the thin air. It's a mere consequence of decades of occupation, humiliation, dispossession, imprisonment, annexation, and settlement activities. It is also coming from years of impunity of successive Israeli government and their policies, years of indifference by the international community to their plight that brought the Palestinians to this explosive situation, to a state of despair that left them with no recourse but to defend themselves. Evictions of the Palestinians from their ancestral homes in Jerusalem have been going on since the beginning of the occupation, in a policy that aims at emptying Jerusalem of its Palestinian population. The Sheikh Jarrah case is only the latest example of that policy. Demolition of homes is another Israeli policy that the Palestinians see it rightly as uprooting them from their land. For the first time in decades, the continued oppression of the Israeli policies and government actions have united the Palestinians like never before. The general strike that's being observed is a wake-up call to everybody that going back to the status quo ante will not pass this time. Madam President, the Palestinians and the world are demanding change. They are rejecting Israel's continued policy of creating facts on the ground and undermining the agreed-upon formula for peace. They want a commitment and adherence to the comprehensive, lasting settlement, a just solution, one that ends the occupation and preserves the foundations of a Palestinian state to make the two-state solution viable. They want from the Security Council to shoulder its responsibility under the Charter and end this war. The United Nations and the international community must renew their support and commitment to a settlement that guarantees the political rights of the Palestinians and a solution on the basis of international law, United Nations resolutions 242, 338, 2334, and the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, and the principle of land for peace that leads to the establishment of an independent Palestinian state with Al-Quds Sharif as its capital. Time is of essence on reaching a solution to the Palestinian question. Extremism and radicalization are on the rise inside Israel, and the senseless attacks that we saw the last 2 weeks raise alarm bells of what to come. The chants of death to the Arabs heard by these extremists culminated in lynching of a Palestinian last week. The Palestinians are afforded protection under the Geneva Conventions, and the Israeli government has the responsibility to do so. Israel has also the responsibility to adhere to international humanitarian law when dealing with the Palestinians and those around it. A week ago, Israeli forces shot and killed an unarmed 21-year-old Lebanese protester who was expressing his solidarity with the Palestinians on the border. The continued Israeli attacks are fueling emotions and anger all over the Arab world. The tensions on the southern border of Lebanon are a stark reminder that the whole region will not find durable peace and security unless the Palestinian question is resolved. Lebanon remains committed to Resolution 1701 and does not want to see escalation. Israel also destroyed the building that housed the international media in Gaza. The world will not be blind with Israeli actions if it destroys the building that journalists work and live in. Madam President, in conclusion, we call for a ceasefire that will stop the suffering of the Palestinian people and the bloodshed. But a ceasefire is not a solution. It is a band-aid. What is needed now is a political solution that ends this conflict once and for all. What's needed now is freedom for the Palestinians, end of occupation, and for Jerusalem to be once again the city of peace for the whole world. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Lebanon. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom.
Have made clear violence across Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories must stop. The United Kingdom offers our deepest condolences to the families of those civilians killed. The United Kingdom calls for an immediate ceasefire to prevent the further loss of life and a worsening humanitarian situation. We continue to support the ongoing UN, Egyptian, and Qatari mediation efforts. The United Kingdom unequivocally condemns the firing of rockets at civilian populations. These acts of terrorism and incitement from Hamas and other terrorist groups must permanently end. Madam President, Israel has a legitimate right to self-defense and the right to defend its citizens from attack. In doing so, it is vital that Israel makes every effort to avoid civilian casualties. We call on Israel to adhere to the principles of necessity and proportionality when defending its legitimate security interest. We're also concerned by reports that Hamas is again using civilian infrastructure and populations as cover for military operations. We are gravely concerned, Madam President, by UN reports that medical installations, schools, and hundreds of homes in Gaza have been destroyed or seriously damaged. That is why, Madam President, the United Kingdom has today announced we will provide an initial £3.2 million to UNRWA's emergency flash appeal. This support will help UNRWA deliver life-saving humanitarian aid to those that need it most. The United Kingdom also urges unimpeded entry and exit of vital humanitarian supplies and personnel, and that Hamas cease their mortar attacks on these crossings. Madam President, I reiterate the importance of maintaining the historic status quo in Jerusalem. The United Kingdom strongly supports the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan's important role as custodian of the holy sites. As my Foreign Secretary reiterated this week, the United Kingdom firmly opposes settlements in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, as well as demolitions and evictions of Palestinians from their homes. Madam President, recent events highlight the urgent need to make progress towards a two-state solution, a safe and secure Israel, alongside a viable Palestinian state, based on 1967 lines, with Jerusalem as the shared capital. Above all, Madam President, the United Kingdom will continue pushing for an end to violence and a political pathway to peace. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. Before we conclude this morning's session, if there is no objection, I would like to give the floor to the observer of the League of Arab States at this stage. And I hear no objection. It is so decided. I now give the floor to the observer of the League of Arab States.
شكرا سيادة الرئيسة السيدة رئيسة الجمعية العامة.
Thank you, Madam President. President of the General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General, in recent years, Israel has set back any prospect for a political settlement to the Palestinian question and has engaged in methodical brainwashing, during which they have presented the aggressed as the aggressor and presented the occupied people as practicing unjustifiable violence. The current moment is very telling. The world is seeing the reality of things, namely a just cause of people who have been in the grip of a terrible military occupation for years and an apartheid regime that is practicing a new form of ethnic cleansing. This is the truth of things that the entire world has been able to see in the districts of East Jerusalem as well as other occupied Palestinian regions in recent weeks. Amongst a deluge of Israeli strikes in Gaza with hundreds of innocent lives taken, we must not forget that this bloody conflagration of this conflict began in occupied East Jerusalem. The spark that set this off was a series of racist, provocative and deliberate measures on the part of the Israeli occupying forces. These forces are behaving like any other occupation in history. That is to say, they are seizing the property of the indigenous people, chasing them from their homes and replacing them with settlers. This is a clear violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. In Jerusalem, the Israeli settler has every right they need: security, property, freedom of movement. But as for the Palestinians, they live under threat of expulsion from their homes at any time. They do not have the right to practice their religion freely, nor to have free access to their sites of prayer. They do not have the right to freedom of movement in the cities in which they were born. They live isolated from the rest of their people, several kilometers away from them, separated by a wall, by inspection checkpoints and practices of daily humiliation. This situation is contrary to the direction of history, actually, and is contrary to all human moral principles. Those courageous peoples that have expressed solidarity with those expelled from their homes, these Palestinians who have decided to fight against the Judaization plan of Al-Quds in Salwan, in Jarrah, and other districts of the city, have exercised their legal right to civil struggle, and the response was rubber bullets, excessive violence, tear gas, arrests, and then bombardments in Gaza, affecting residents, hospitals, schools, and even the offices of international media outlets. These are bombardments that killed more than 220 martyrs thus far. Madam President, this assembly is the world's conscience, and it is free from any coercion. The assembly must express a clear position on the fact that the occupation is continuing without political prospects and without any calendar for an end to this occupation. Today, this cause is at a dangerous tipping point with the increasing power of the extreme right in Israel. Extremist settlers are even expressly calling for the killing of Arabs, for them to be hunted, chased from their lands, and this has essentially become the program of the Israeli government, and it is unfortunate that a conflagration in the Holy City and that the punishing of civilians in Gaza and elsewhere has become the way in which one can remain in power in Israel. The current bloody crisis has demonstrated the danger that there is when the international community turns away from the Palestinian question. The two-state solution, based on negotiations, is a solution the chances of which are eroding day after day. It has been supported by the Arab League unanimously. However, the occupying power prefers a solution based on a system of apartheid, and is ready to take this right to the end, to put this apartheid in place through violence and through crimes against humanity. The League of Arab States calls upon this august assembly to reject this flawed logic which aims to prolong the occupation. It is high time that we hear the voice of the world's conscience, your voice, to reject this situation, this condemnable situation, and it is high time that the Israeli occupation answer for its crimes. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the observer of the League of Arab States for his statement. We have heard the last speaker in the debate on these items for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers this afternoon at 3 p.m. in this hall. Before adjourning the meeting, may I kindly request delegates to leave the hall while maintaining physical distancing. I thank you for your cooperation, and this meeting is adjourned.
Yes, back at
Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the secondary audio circuit for the Reuters